No, thanks a lot for actually, no, that's reserved. Start now. Where was that? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, kindly ensure your mobile phones are on silent to ensure a pleasant and uninterrupted session. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, a very good morning to all of you. I am Izati, your MC for today. To start our proceedings, I would like to invite Indiami Diop, World Bank Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand to deliver his welcoming remarks. Indiami?
Thank you very, very much. First and foremost, warm welcome to all of you. And also, I understand many participants online. So thank you very much for coming today. And let me also extend our thanks to the Asia Business School, represented here by Abigail. Thank you very much for hosting us. We are very, very pleased with the collaboration with your school. I would like to recognize the presence of YB Mustafa, known as Tokpa. He's a former Minister of Trade. So this subject today is very close to his heart. But he's more recently, he was the Minister for Economy and a great partner for the World Bank. So one thing that sort of sets apart the office we have here in Malaysia, that we have this little hub of researchers, group of researchers under the leadership of our wonderful country chief economist, Aditya. And that group does research. They do research that are policy relevant, academic research. And one of the things Aditya and I and Yasuhiko, who's the country manager here, have been talking about is to really reinforce the partnership with local universities and the research communities and leverage that to even extend the partnership with regional researchers and global researchers. So today, I'm really, really pleased to see a sort of concrete realization of that objective that we have set for this office. And I really hope that this marks the beginning of a very strong and vibrant partnership with all the researchers that are here present today to really discuss some topics that are of utmost importance for our countries in the region, but also globally. I'm very pleased also that we have decided, actually we have discussed with Aditya to sort of make this a sort of yearly event, right? Every year, bringing everybody together and then really having a very good 1 day or 2 day discussion of topics that are really important for us. Now, the topic today couldn't be more relevant. I think what's happening on trade globally will affect all countries. The global trade environment is changing quite significantly. And for countries in this region that have actually leveraged trade to grow and to transform themselves, it is actually a big deal. So I'm very glad that we have a large number of researchers and papers to be presented today and tomorrow on this topic. I'm not surprised that Aditya chose this topic first because it's also close to his heart. And Aditya is our reference and authority on trade at the World Bank. So when I saw it first, I said, I'm not surprised. So anyway, thank you very, very much for coming today. And warm welcome to everyone. We look forward for productive discussion in the next 2 days. And let me close just by wishing everyone, because many of you have traveled from afar to be here, wishing you a nice stay in Malaysia, which is a wonderful country. And I hope you have the chance to really see more than this conference room during your stay here. So thank you very much. And let's have really a very productive day, 2 days on this in this venue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ndiame, for the welcoming remarks. Once again, on behalf of my colleagues at the World Bank and our co-organizer, the Asia School of Business, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Trade and Global Value Chains in Times of Insecurity conference here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. This conference will take place for 2 days, and we have plenty of interesting and insightful events planned. Today's program comprised of 3 sessions themed around trade tensions, global production networks, and lastly, trade and the environment. Up next, I invite Professor Dr. Abigail Tay, Deputy Dean and Faculty Chair of the Asia School of Business, to provide the opening remarks.
Thank you, Ndiame, for that welcome. I think you said what I was going to say, so I think we just end here, but I just add that I'm so delighted to be teaming up with the World Bank, to have you all today here speaking on this very relevant and important topic of trade and global value chains. We, Malaysia, are an important trading nation. And welcome, Tokpa. You understand how trade is important to our country and to the whole region. So we're very excited to have you here. And I just want to give you a sort of brief intro to the Asia School of Business. We were set up in 2015. So we're about 8 years old, and that's how long I've been here. We aim to develop leaders for the emerging world, and topics like that just seem so relevant for us as a school. We are not just an education center, but also a global knowledge hub. So we have, short courses as well as 3 degree programs at the moment, hoping to open more. We have the MBA that develops, business leaders for the region. And we also have a unique program that I just want to make a special mention to. It's called the Masters in Central Banking, that is designed specially for central bankers. And it focuses on developing policy makers that can navigate the fast-changing economic and financial system environment that we live in. And this conference is hosted by the team, the macro central banking team, as part of our Central Banking Research Center that's led by Oza, who's here. So thank you to that team for making this event happen. I just also want to add thanks to the many people that working tirelessly behind the scenes for the last months and weeks to create this very exciting program that I see. We have a distinguished panel of speakers and panelists. So thank you all for coming to Malaysia or joining us remotely. Special thanks to Aditya and his World Bank team for working and collaborating with us, to the World Bank KL Research Hub. Thank you so much. And to my ASB team, who is on the ground and I know outside running around to make sure everything moves smoothly here. So welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. Hope you enjoy the next 2 days here. This program is really exciting, and I'm sure it'll be a productive 2 days for all of us. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Abigail, for that heartwarming remarks. Without further ado, let us jump to our very first session on trade tensions. In this session, we will have three presenters in the following order. First, Citizen Siame from the University of Minnesota. And then online, joining us virtually will be Yang Zhou from Fudan University. And then last for the session, we have Lauren Powells from New York University, Abu Dhabi. Each presenter will have around 20 minutes to present, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of open discussion on the paper. So a total of 40 minutes is allocated to each paper. Request an uninterrupted 5-minute start to the presentation, after which participants are welcome to ask any clarifying questions during the presentation and keep detailed questions for afterwards. For our YouTube participants, please post your questions in the chat and we will ask them at an opportune time. So please welcome Celestine.
I think the mic is. Sorry, everyone, for correction and all. Good morning. I'm Celestine Siame, and today I'll be presenting on Brexit, trade in intermediates, and global value chain. That is beyond the UK and the EU. So this is the outline of my presentation. So as we all know, Brexit is currently in effect, and the UK is now a standalone country after being dependent on the EU for more than 40 years. And following this segregation, different possible Brexit scenarios have been adopted or may be adopted either in the short or the long term that could create economic impact in various forms, such as high structural unemployment, reduced FDI, growth deceleration, a more restricted EU migration, and a higher trade cost. So my study will focus on the effects of a higher trade cost. Why? Because with a higher trade cost, this will create trade policy effects between the UK, the remaining EU 27, and the rest of the world. However, it appears the discussion on the future trade relationship after Brexit has focused only on the UK and the EU, and the rest of the world countries have been ignored from the public debate. But it is important to consider this rest of the world countries. Why? Because most of them have the UK as their major trading partner. A majority of them also import from the larger EU market. So if both the UK and the EU are affected from Brexit, it creates a domino effect, and this rest of the world countries also get affected. And these are some key facts. So these are some key facts to confirm that. So these are 30 selected countries that trade most with the UK. And from these 30 selected countries, we can see that aside Sri Lanka and Mauritius, which have like more than 20% of their export share to the UK, almost all the countries have like more than 10% of their export share to the UK. Another fact. Sorry. This is not working. Okay, so you couldn't hear me. So let me just use the mic. Hello? Hello? So where is the highlighter? I can't find you. Pick the highlighter. The highlighter. You click and you pick that. Okay. So I think I'll go backwards a bit. So these are some key facts to confirm that. So these are 30 selected countries which trade most with the UK. And we can see that aside Sri Lanka and Mauritius, which have more than 20% of their export share to the UK, we have almost all the other countries having like 10% of their export share to the UK. Another key fact is that if you look at the aggregate trade flows, that's the to and fro of imports, the to and fro from the UK. We can see that on the export side, the UK have about 62% of their export. That is, the EU have about 62% of their export to the UK. And the 30 selected countries which trade most with the UK have about 32%, and the rest of the world have about 6%. And on the import side, the EU imports about 52% from the UK. The 30 selected countries have about 36, almost 37%, and the rest of the world countries have about 11%. So this shows how the UK and the EU are integrated in global trading, and the need to look at the rest of the world countries when you are looking at the effects of Brexit on trade. Okay, so motivated by these considerations, I examined the effects of Brexit due to trade policy shock, which is not limited to only the UK and the EU, but with a much focus on the rest of the world countries which trade most with the UK. And And to do this particularly, I answered two main questions. I came up with two main research questions. And the first one is, what are the welfare effects and the magnitude of gains from trade under different potential Brexit scenarios? And the second one is, how do these possible Brexit scenarios affect global value chains? So someone will ask, why do I want to look at global value chains with respect to Brexit? So due to the sharp fragmentation of production process, and the reorganization of global economic activity. Now, global production is organized into what we call, it's integrated into what we call global value chains, whereby firms source inputs or they source components of products globally from from multiple producers who are based in different countries, and they use them either as inputs or they use them as final consumption, which then makes it more relevant to look at models with multi-stage production instead of looking at a traditional gravity model. Why? Because with a traditional gravity model, the value added at the multiple stages of productions are hidden. Another reason too has to do with the cost of trade barriers, which will be multiplied due to the multiple movement of goods across national borders, which then means if like countries are participating on the value chain and there is a disruption in one part of the value chain, all the other countries participating will also be affected. And the third one is has to do with the fact that growth in global value chains amplifies welfare gains to trade barriers than when we look at bilateral trade model. So what did I do for my study? I did three major things. I built a static general equilibrium. Then the second thing, I did a quantitative analysis. Then the third thing was I compared, the quantitative analysis was my calibration, which gave me the no Brexit equilibrium. Then I compared that with different counterfactual. So for my model, I have a multi-country and a multi-sector emitting model. And this model features 33 countries. I have the UK, the EU 27, and 30 selected countries. And I have 12 sectors, 11 tradable sectors, and a single service sector. So I use the input-output linkages, and I showed a trade policy shock with it. So for the quantitative analysis, I calibrated my model to match the 2015 era, that's the multi-region input-output data. And that calibrated model was what gave me the no Brexit equilibrium. That is the state of the world when Brexit has not even been conceived. So for the quantifactual, what I did was to look at 5 different possible Brexit scenarios that could happen after Brexit. So I look at the hard Brexit and I look at the soft Brexit. I look at the UK, the EU, FTA, which is the current Brexit, which is called the EU UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Then I look at what if the UK and the USA decide to form a free trade agreement, and what if the three regions, the UK, EU, and the USA, decide to form a free trade agreement. So to briefly, the hard Brexit is simply whereby the UK loses its single market access and custom union. So they live like they exit the EU without any agreement. And the soft Brexit is the case whereby they retain single market access. So they are not part of the custom union, but they are part of the single market access. So the current Brexit that they've agreed on is similar to the soft Brexit. But with the current Brexit, that is the TCA, they are not part of the single market access, and they are also not part of the custom union, but they came at an agreement. So it's similar to, it's between the hard Brexit and the soft Brexit. So this is a preview of the results I came up with. So for the results, I will briefly talk about the hard Brexit, the current Brexit, and the soft. So for the welfare losses, I measured welfare in terms of consumption equivalence. That's the consumption of the households. And I found welfare losses ranging from 0.01% to 3.06%. That is for the hard Brexit. And the average loss was about 1.61%. But when we look at the UK, that is the current Brexit in effect, there were also losses. The pattern of losses in the current Brexit and the hard Brexit are the same, just that the current Brexit losses are a bit smaller than that of the hard Brexit. Then for the soft Brexit, what happened is that like all countries, there was like a gain for all other countries, except for UK, which I expect the UK to experience a loss, and Iceland and Mauritius. I will explain further when I get to the results section. So in general, I would say there is with the with the results, I would say there was more losses in the hard Brexit than the UK and the EU FTA, and relatively minor losses under the soft Brexit. And for the global value chain participation, I look at just the effect under soft Brexit and the hard Brexit, because the other scenarios gave me similar results. So I focus on just the hard and the soft Brexit. And aside the UK and the EU getting affected in terms of their participation and positioning on the value chain, other countries like Singapore, Japan, China, South Korea, Kenya, Indonesia were also affected. So this is the model I use. So my model as like it's a household, it has household and it has firms. I have my goods being perfect substitutes. I have an elastic labor. I have one factor of production and a composite intermediate good. And all the goods and factor markets are perfectly competitive. I have mobile labor across sectors and immobile across countries. And I have costly trade. So I'm looking at both iceberg trade costs and I'm looking at import tariff. So this is the household problem whereby firms, whereby consumers, right, maximize a utility problem. And for the alphas that you see in the model, those are the expenditure shares, that is to different sectors. And for the segments, those are the elasticity of substitution. So if we look at the summation of the alphas across countries, that is going from different sectors, they all sum up to one. And I have the total income of a country, which is the YG, which is, it constitutes that of the labor income and that of the revenue generated from import tariff. So this is the the production problem, whereby I have a runabout input production. And if I say runabout, it's whereby input is either used for final consumption or it's used as an intermediate input. And I have this being that is the output being produced in this case, depending on the technology, which is the AI, and I have it depending on the labor, that is the labor demanded, which is the L, and I have it depending on the composite intermediate input. And these composite intermediate inputs are sourced from all sectors of a country. So for the elasticity of substitution, the assumption here is that that's for the consumption and the production are the same. So this is the pricing in my model. So I have the cost of, that's the cost of producing, because I'm looking at intermediate input and the labor demand. The cost of the input bundle is a constitution of the wages and the prices. So that is the price index of the composite intermediate input. And for the price of a good, that will be the cost of that product divided by the technology of that country. Okay, so as I said, I have a costly trade. So I'm looking at iceberg trade cost and I'm looking at import tariff. So for the cost of the good at a destination to be consumed, that is, if we are looking there, it will be the price of the good produced in that country multiplied by the iceberg trade cost, and the same with import tariff. So what I did in my model was that I combined both the iceberg trade cost and the import tariff to get the CAPA. So that gave me a combined trade cost. So the price of a good at a destination of a country is going to be that combined trade cost times the price of that product. Okay, so this is my general equilibrium market clearing condition, which I wouldn't brief. Okay, so someone will ask, where is Brexit in my model? So the Brexit simply has to do with the trade cost. The effect of the Brexit in my study is simply coming from the trade costs. But I'm looking at two major trade costs here. I'm looking at tariff and I'm looking at non-tariff trade barriers, right? But for the non-tariff trade barriers, it's not easily, it's not easily observed, but it's part of iceberg trade costs. So what I did was to calibrate my iceberg trade costs, and I assume that a fraction of that is my non-tariff trade barriers. So that is the NTB. So the non-tariff trade barriers is what I term as the NTB. So when you look at the price in this case. So if you look at the price, so this is the tariff, this is the non-tariff trade barrier, and this is the iceberg trade cost. So we can see that the iceberg trade cost, we have the non-tariff trade barrier being subtracted from the iceberg trade cost. which is a proportion of that, multiply by these non-tariff trade barriers, then the tariff. So this gives me the pricing in the state of Brexit. So this is whereby we find Brexit in my study. Okay, so for my data, I use the error input output data. I use different sets of data, but for the main data was for the error input outputs MRA database, and I have 189 countries and I have 26 sectors in that data. So 20, beginning I said I have 12 sectors, and it's 12 sectors mainly because I have 15 services sector that I aggregated them to be one service sector. So for the so I have the MNF tariff, and I also use Comtrade data and the UNTAD data to like develop some tariff data. Yeah. So the next. So for the calibration strategy, I just assign standard parameters. That's the elasticity of substitution. Then I also I calibrated the value added shares from the data. Then I calibrated the remaining parameters. So this is so this is from a paper, GVC. I use the elasticities. Then these are the parameters I calibrated. So this is the estimation of the tariff. I already talked about using the on-site trains data, using the WTO data and the country data. So this is the iceberg calibration. So I look at an over-identified estimation whereby I have two data moments and two model moments, which calibrates just one set of parameters. That is the iceberg trade cost. And the job here was to match the two data moments, which is the intermediate input of the input-output metrics and the final demand with the total value of import values for input and final good. So this is the calibrated iceberg trade cost that I came up with. So for the different scenarios, for the hard Brexit, I use the MF. So that is the state whereby the UK, the trading between UK and other countries will fall back to the WTO. So that will be MFN tariff. And I simulated a 50% increase in non-tariff trade barriers because there will be high increase in non-tariff trade barrier between the UK and other countries. And for the soft Brexit, I'll talk about just the hard Brexit and the soft Brexit. For the soft Brexit, it's whereby they exit from the single market. So there is a zero tariff between the UK trade and the EU. But for the other countries, it depends. That is if the UK have already negotiated a new agreement or they've already replicated what they had under the EU. And for the soft Brexit too, there will be a very less increase in non-tariff trade barriers. So for the welfare, I measured my welfare in consumption, as I've already said. And the results of my welfare, so I'll talk about the soft and the hard Brexit. So we can see here that in the case there, almost all countries experience a loss for the hard Brexit. And for the soft Brexit, we can see a lot of gains. And for the hard Brexit, two countries that did not really see a loss was India and Korea. And I think India has to do with the fact that India has competitive advantage in IT, technology, engineering, and all those are. So I believe they are going to be a net gainer in terms of services when Brexit happens. And it also has to do with the trade cost. So if we look at a calibrated trade cost for the services, it's one of the highest trade costs. So this highest, so they are going to experience a gain from there because of the competitive advantage they have in terms of services, in terms of IT and other technology. Now, when we look at the pattern of what the effect that is the hard Brexit and the UK EU, we can see that the pattern is the same. They have the same pattern, but just that of the hard Brexit, there was a very high loss compared to the current Brexit, which is the UK EU FTA. Okay, so now global value chain. So for the global value chain, I just look at two scenarios, the hard and soft, because it was the same results for other scenarios. And from here, we can see that almost all countries in the state of Brexit, the pattern, that is that the backward participation is the same as the domestic value added, which is the Yeah, which is the same as the domestic value added versus the gross domestic, the ratio of the domestic value added to the gross output. And we can see that under the Brexit, there will be some slight fall in terms of the participation of global value chain, both in terms of backward participation and in terms of forward participation. And the same thing also appears when we look at the positioning in both at the upstream and the downstream. We can see that under Brexit, which is the hard and the soft Brexit, the change in the participation, the positioning changes fall down to a bit lower rate. So in conclusion, I would say there was significant impact of warfare on other countries aside the UK and the EU, and there was relatively minor losses under soft Brexit. So I would say the hard Brexit is the worst case scenario. The soft Brexit is the least detrimental, and the UK, the EU, FTA, there was also some losses. And for GVC, that is the global value chain participation and positioning changes following Brexit, hard Brexit and soft Brexit, there was quite some changes. So overall, I would say most of the changes in the warfare and in the global value chain has to do with the non-tariff trade barriers because there was more heterogeneity than that of the tariff. And finally, my conclusion would be that the magnitude of the impact, right, of the losses will depend on the trade agreement that the UK finally negotiates with other countries after Brexit. Thank you.
So if there's any questions, please press the mic buttons in front of you and to unmute, and then you can ask.
The India result, I didn't quite, and the India and Korea result, which is I didn't quite see the logic to the model of how they get a gain. Like I understand what you were saying in terms of the comparative advantage, but through the model, I didn't quite see how the model would use the comparative advantage in the services to translate to a gain. So can you just walk through that?
So I said competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Not comparative.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I, so in terms of, so this comparative advantage is not in this particular model.
Okay.
So it's just like in terms of competing with other countries
But-
because they are skillful in IT and all those.
And that's what the British are doing particularly well. And so then when the trade costs come, it's a pure kind of diversion story.
Yeah, so because they will be more in demand because of their
Yeah.
skillful nature. So it's going to benefit them compared to other countries.
But is there something also that the services are less likely to be used as inputs in these GVCs?
It could be possible.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I enjoyed it. I have a question about, in the beginning, you showed that Sri Lanka and Mauritius were really, whether exposed is the right word, in terms of a high trade share with the UK, but they seem to come out quite differently. Is that, because if I remember, Mauritius was particularly badly affected, but not Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so Sri Lanka was also affected, but I don't have Sri Lanka. I didn't select Sri Lanka as part of, I have like 33 countries. So I selected just 12 countries, but Sri Lanka was also very affected. Yeah, so in my main paper, which I can share with you later, I have Sri Lanka getting also very affected.
So in terms of thinking about, let's say, how countries rack up in terms of losses and are they only purely a share of the size of trade, or do they also depend upon the sectors in which they're trading, the substitutability across different countries? So in the sense of your model, does that allow for that aspect, or do they just neatly rank up by the magnitudes of trade?
So I wouldn't say it just has to do with the share of the trade. I think everything combined, the sector, the substitutability and all those things. But I can't show everything on the screen, but everything inclusive. So I think, Amit, I didn't get the last part of your question, so I'll be happy. Okay.
partly following on his question, it would be interesting, I guess, to unpack a little bit more the service sector, right? Because I guess data limitation makes it easier to make it one. But precisely because of what you said, it would be nice to have a little bit more sectors in the service because you could.
Yeah, so I did have 15 services sector, but what I did was to aggregate them. But I have another resource whereby I have it for each of the different sectors, right? So there are 15 of them, which I can slightly, no, let me just go down. Yeah, so these are my sectors. Yeah, so these are all the services sectors. So I have 15 of them. But I aggregate all these sectors to one. That is why I said I have 26 sectors, but in the main mode, I said I have 12 sectors, so 11 tradables and that. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
I have a question. So I believe when the EU, when UK was in the EU and they had that trade pattern, okay, after the Brexit, what sort of preparatory policies that the UK government took in order to balance the trade deficit? Because I believe when there was a Brexit, UK happened to escalate in terms of trade deficit. What sort of policies that the government of the UK sort of took to down shock the trade deficit that will upcoming happen in the future? And did it work actually if it happened?
Okay, so you're talking about trade deficits, which is a bit beyond my scope here. But what I would say is that so if you are looking at the deficit part, right, and we want to look at the UK coming out of the EU, what the UK began doing before they finally came out was that they began replicating some of the agreements that they had with the UK, with the EU, the same agreement. So like a country like Kenya, a country like South Korea, like South Africa, right? They replicated that. So the replication means it's the same thing. So what happens is that they will trade under the same conditions. So I believe those are some of the policy, right? And another thing too could be that some countries they will feel like, okay, under the EU, we didn't really have a very good like negotiation. So this will be an opportunity, especially if they are focusing on developing countries. This will be an opportunity for us to do our own negotiation with those countries. So I believe all these kind of different policies on trade agreement coming into effect is something which is going to reduce the trade deficit, which I don't think it's fully doing because it's still in the initial stages. Yeah.
So we have a question from a YouTube participant as well. Evelyn from University Malaya asked, did you consider NTMs, non-tariff measures? Are these measures measured as or modeled as a fixed cost?
They are not fixed costs. So that is the NTBs. They are not fixed costs. They are variable costs. So it depends on the country trading and all that, and the destination and the distance.
Okay.
Yes, because when we look at non-tariff trade barriers, that is the iceberg trade code. It has to do with custom checking, licensing, quotas, import substitution. So so many different things comes into place here.
Right, so we'll thank you very much. We'll move on to our second presenter, Yang Zhu, who will present via WebEx.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me? And seeing the screen I'm sharing at the same time.
We can hear you, Yangzhou.
Okay, great. Okay, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to the GVC conference in the World Bank. And my name is Yang Zhou, and I'm from Fudan University. Today, I'm gonna presenting this project, which is the U.S.-China trade war and global value chains. Okay. So the motivation, so the big background, so the U.S.-China trade war is the most significant trade war since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930s. So basically during the trade war, there are 550 billion Chinese goods was announced to be attacked, and 185 billion US dollars of United States trade good announced to be targeted. And so the trade war is still an ongoing process. But in this project, I'm gonna focus on the period from January 2018 to January 2022, which is when the Phase 1 deal established. So from January 2018 to January 2020, so the weighted average of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods increased from 3.1% to 19.3%. At the same time, China's tariffs on U.S. goods increases from 8% to 20.3%. So nowadays, like if we consider the most current tariffs, the tariffs level is still like pretty close to the level on in January 2020. So basically, tariff doesn't change so much after the Phase 1 deal. So the trade war can basically be divided into two rounds. So the first round starts in July to August 2018. So in this round, the U.S. implements an additional 25% of the tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese exports. As a retaliation, China implements additional 25% of tariffs on 50 billion US dollars on US exports. So most of the goods in this round are on intermediate goods. So that's round 1. And round 2 starts in the following year, June 2019. And in this round, US implements 10% to 25% of tariffs on 200 billion US dollars Chinese goods. And China implements 5% to 25% tariffs on 60 billion US dollars on US exports. And since lots of intermediate goods are already included in the first round, so in the second round, there's more on consumption goods getting involved. So this graph shows the tariff changes over time. So the blue curve is China's tariffs on U.S. and the red one is U.S. tariffs on Chinese exports. So this is like the 2 rounds, and finally this is the tariff level on the Phase 1 agreement. So that is a big picture about the trade war. And then the trade war occurs in the context of a growing global value chains. So as Celestine just introduced, global value chain involves each country focus on a particular stages of a production process. So all those following literatures introduce the measurement of global value chain. So this graph is a download graph from the World Bank's for Development Report in 2020. the horizontal is the time and the vertical is the GVC's share of global trade. So basically it measures how much percentage of the global trade is contributed by global value chain. So the idea to measure it is, so we measure it using the inter-country or world input and output table, and to chase those goods, those exports that cross borders at least twice, and consider them as the trade of global value chain. So we can see from this picture that during the time we can see like this increase in GVC share of global trade, and recently the trade is around at 45% to 50%. So now here comes my questions. So given the breakout of the trade war and the growing trend of global value chain, so what is the impact of the trade war on different industries and different countries in presence of global value chains? So basically the idea is when country facing the shock in tariffs, and if they are able to freely switch their sourcing places. So if we let the global value chains to be freely reshaped without any frictions, what could be the impact? So it's like when China is increasing the tariffs against the United States. So suppose like US is able to shift its sourcing quickly from China to other substitutable Southeast Asian country, such like Vietnam and etc. So in that context, so what could be the impact on different country and different industries? So here are some findings. So in this paper, I quantify the impact of these two rounds of the trade war, and find that so the first round, the CPI in the United States is going to increase by 0.03%, and the second round is increased by 0.06%. So this percentage change is compared to, both of them is compared to the benchmark where the trade war hasn't started yet. So, and the second finding is that both rounds of trade war reduce U.S. downstream employment, will increase on U.S. upstream employment. And the intuition is that those downstream employment relies on those imports imported from China, and raising up the price of the imports going to hurt the downstream employment. But those U.S. upstream employment happen to be like protected by the tariffs imposed on Chinese imports. So so those groups, the upstream employers, and happens upstream producers happens to be the groups which are benefit from from this trade war. And also, like this especially hit the U.S. industries that heavily relied on targeting Chinese intermediate goods. As for the welfare analysis, I choose the year before the trade war as a base year. So choose 2017 as a base year. So in terms of real income, in the trade war, in the round one, it's going to cost China about $12.2 billion US, and cost the United States about $7.5 billion US. And the second round is going to cost China about $35.2 billion US, and cost the United States about $15.6 billion US. So the contribution of this paper is that, so this paper builds a two-stage multi-industry, multi-country general equilibrium model to study the impact of the trade war while taking into account the shaping of GVC. So as I emphasized before, that we allow country to freely to change their sourcing places without any frictions. And so we built the standard equilibrium model with the reshaping of GVC and allows this tariff revenue to be collected and rebated to the local consumers. And also, when I calibrate this model, I add another dimension of comparative advantage at a stage level by estimating the share of each industry that is in upstream and in downstream stages. So basically in my model, the comparative advantage is not only at industry level, at country level, but also at stage level, because I want to capture the structure that countries are able to focus on different stages of different industries. So there are several related literature, and so the top one of those related literature about U.S.-China trade war, and the bottom one, the ones focusing on and study the structure of global value chains. So in all of those papers, I want to compare my result versus the one from the Fashika-Bombs 2020. So they also build a general equilibrium model, but instead of building a general equilibrium model of the world, they focus on the United States and taking the import price as given. And so they figure that the trade war is going to cost the United States about 7.2 billion US dollars, which is a number smaller than mine. So I think the intuitive explanation is that in my model, I let all the countries to freely adjust their sourcing places, which could amplify the impact of the tariffs. So here is a model. So it's a multi-country model. So I stands for the country index, and S stands for industry, and the variety Z is the variety index within each industry. So this part is very similar to the part presented by Celestine. So the utility of each country is a Cohn-Douglas function of consumption from each industry, and BS is the expenditure share on the particular industry. As for this big CIS, it's going to be an CES aggregator of all the varieties within that industry. So, and the domestic consumer budget constraint is the following. And the consumer income is from two sources. One is from the wage income, and the other is from the tariff revenue income collected by the government. So again, the government collected tariff revenue and rebated back to the domestic consumer. So as for the technology, so here is the part I model global value chain in my paper. So this is a technology for each final product Z in an industry. So I assume that each final product Z is produced through two stages. And suppose the stage one occurs in this particular country I. Here is the production function. So basically the production process needs a labor input, which is stage specific. So the superscript stands for stage specific, and country specific, industry specific. So these labor and composite intermediate goods I. So the composite intermediate goods I share the same format as the utility function. And this AIS1Z is a unit factor requirement, which captures the total factor productivity of the technology in stage one. And the gamma here is a labor share. in stage 1. As for stage 2, so the stage 2 it's going to rely on several things. So first, the stage 2 will also need a labor input, which is the LIS2 here, and the composite goods, similar format as a utility function, and the composite intermediate goods in stage 1. So the labor shear is still gamma, and this is the unit factor requirement. But the difference is that in stage two gonna require an output from stage 1, which is captured by this XISZ. So this XISZ and this YISZ are same type of goods. But the stage 2 consumers have these options to either import this stage 1 product from its local country or from a foreign country. And finally, like this is a demonstration of the format of the composite intermediate good. So again, so the notation is complicated, but the whole idea is that it shares the same format as a utility function. So first, it's a Douglas aggregators of all the industries, and then each industry is an CES aggregator of all the varieties within that industry. So the difference is that the expenditure share is different. So the BS here is the final goods expenditure share from final consumption expenditure share from a particular industry S. And this BS prime S captures the input and output linkages. So it's like the destinations industry's share, import share from a particular sourcing industry. But other than that, the format is same as the utility function. So in summary, the structure looks a little bit like confusing, but in summary, the main point is there are two types of intermediate goods in this production process. So the first one is this XIZ here, which is this guy. So
Yangju,
yes.
sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
but there's around 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I will quickly go through it. So basically, two types of intermediate goods. So one is the stage 1 product, connect 2 stages, and the other is the stage 2 product, which is used in production of both stages. So then I introduced this trade cost includes both transportation and both iceberg transportation and tariffs. And so this is a 2-stage production structure. So I have like J countries in that, so which means there's going to be J square production paths. So this project relies on this assumption on the productivity of a production path. So like this is the unit factor requirement at stage 1, and this is unit factor requirement at stage 2. The exponent is a share of stage 1, and this is a share of stage 2. So like if I connected the productivity along the production path, assume the path follows a Frechet distribution and determined by this parameters big T. So it's just like the traditional Frechet distribution in an EK model. And the products from both stages are tradable, and the countries only import from the location offering the lowest price. So given that assumptions, I can get an analytical solutions and solve the general equilibrium about the model. So basically, if there's a tariff shock, it's going to be the change in each country's sourcing strategy. So country is going to source from different places who offering a lower price by taking into account trade shock, and then it's going to change all the endogenous variables. So I'm going to skip the part of calibration, and finally, I want to show some numerical result about the 2 rounds of the trade. So like this is the percentage change in the United States and China. So this is like the price level change, in the round 1 and round 2, and then I have like the upstream employment change, the downstream employment change. So basically, we see that for both country and both runs, the upstream employment actually increases and downstream employment decreases. And in intuition that like both country, if you're looking at your targeting list, lots of goods included in the targeting list are probably intermediate goods. So we're gonna protect domestic stream producers and hurt the domestic downstream producer who rely on those upstream imports. And so this graph shows the goods that targeted in different 2 rounds of the trade war, and this shows the industries that hurt it the most and benefit the most in the first round of trade war and the second round of trade war. And finally, I did this welfare analysis, so which is the result I showed before. So I compare the real income in each country by choosing 2017 as the base year, and in the first round, China is going to cost for 12.2 billion, US cost 7.5 billion. Second round trade war cost China 35.2 billion and it cost the United States 15.6 billion. So yes, that's the result of this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now open up the floor to the questions or discussion. Any comments?
Actually, I have one question.
Yes.
You know, normally we think of rules of origin only in preferential trade agreements, but in this case of a trade war, every other country has preferential access. But you could also see a switching of global value chains, and some work that Shafat and I've done shown that a lot of the other countries which exported more to the United States were importing more from China.
Yes.
What do we know about the rules of origin requirements that China or the United States imposed? And if there were no rules of origin, was it, did countries have infinite flexibility to switch value chains?
Okay, so basically, when I calibrate, thank you for your question, first of all. So when I calibrate model, so for the roots of origin is I calibrated based on the year before the trade war. So the year before, so I used I use those trade flows before the trade wars to calibrate the comparative advantage in different country, different industry, and different stages. So I assume that so I assume this comparative advantage, which is calculated by this particular parameter here. So I assume this comparative advantage parameters doesn't change over time. So this is the one determines the roots of the sourcing places. So given that, I only let the tariffs to change. And so basically, finally how the GVC is shaped is a joint effect of both the comparative advantage and the trade cost. So it's like the benchmark is the comparative advantage plus the trade cost before the trade war, and now it's the same comparative advantage, but the tariff is changed. Does that answer a question?
Yes, thank you. But we can talk about it more at some stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Based on your presentation,
Mhm.
there was a trade deficit between US and China. Now, my question is that, is there a way to leverage this trade deficit and make trade more sustainable through multilateral policies that benefit both countries, US and China, not only for their extended long-term trade ship, but for the good of the world? What are the constraints that kind of stop that based on your opinion and your research for goods and services?
I'm not quite like understanding your question. Can you like rephrase it? Sorry about that.
Okay, perfect. I was saying,
Mhm.
based on your presentation, there is a trade deficit between US and China. Okay, now
Yes.
how to actually leverage on that trade deficit to make trade between both countries more sustainable through multilateral policies, okay, that impact both countries positively. And if so, what may be the constraint that sort of blocks this sort of policies to be implemented in place?
Okay, thank you for your question. So US is running a trade deficit with China. So, but when I was building this model, I assumed that so for the entire economy, so for the this like US, China, and the rest of the world economy, the trade is we have trade balance. But I think like even though like consider trade unbalance in this model, that won't change on it won't change too much about of the conclusion here.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I had a question on the downstream upstream employment result.
Yes.
So if I understand the logic of the model, if I remember correctly, though, both the Chad-Bown paper and also the Fly and Pierce paper about these things, they do find these empirically these negative downstream
Yes.
effects.
Yes.
They do not find this positive upstream effect, and so I was wondering whether there are ways to reconcile the model with the empirical evidence.
Yeah, so like the downstream employment, like is inconsistent with their numerical results. But as for like the upstream, so because like this is also depends on how do I divided the upstream and downstream in this project. So basically the idea, so when I calibrate a model, like I have like 3 countries, so United States, China, and the rest of the world, and 18 industries. And in each industry, so I have like those groups of commodities belongs to the upstreams, and the groups of commodities belongs to the downstream. So basically, when I check the upstream and downstream, I choose a cutoff point. So I assign upstreamness for each commodities and choose a cutoff point to divide it, all commodities in each industries into this upstream and downstream subgroups. So when I check the data, is actually, so if I do this matching, like I match the goods heavily targeted in the trade war, those happens to, majority of them happen to located on the upstream upstream sub industries of each of the 18 industry. So like that's like how this result is coming from. And but you're right. I mean, I need like to check out the ways to verify this result I draw from the impact on the upstream employment. And also, like, I think another explanation is that in my model, I let all the workers to freely move across industries and across stages, but they can't move across countries. So it's a general equilibrium model. So the downstream employment are herded. So like they moved to the upstream. So that's like the intuition, like to generate result. But I need to check out more papers to find numerical evidence to support my result here. Thank you very much for asking the question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I think you presented round 1 and round 2 of the trade war. But more recently, what we've seen is also some restrictions on, technology cooperation and so on. And I was just wondering whether you have looked at, the sort of dynamic effects of that sort of third round of trade tension, because the concern is really how that would affect technology adoption, flows of ideas, flows of knowledge, and things that have really increased efficiency globally and reduced even inflation globally. So the question is, if you were to do this exercise in a dynamic context, using not a static model, but a dynamic one, what would be the sort of anticipation for the result in that framework?
Thank you very much for your question. So this part mainly focusing on like the impact of tariffs. But the trade policy nowadays, the trade tension nowadays involves more than just tariffs. So as you mentioned, like the technology sanctions. So if we put it into a dynamic framework, this could be, I'm thinking like we could add the change in, because like I have this productivity, the big T, so we can have like add the dynamic on this big T. For example, like we have like the growing T in China and the growing T in the United States, and the growing T in China is going to relate it to how intense it has a trade with the United States, so we like the learning by doing process. So when the United States is doing like a sanction, a technology sanction to China, it's gonna have this strong negative impact on the growth of this big T. And so later on, which gonna makes like probably the United States gonna like shift like this technology to some other countries. So which gonna decrease China's comparative advantage in that particular industry and will even amplify the negative impact of the trade war if we're taking into account the technology sanctions regarding those productivity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a curiosity in
I
your
would
model,
like to
initially is
extrapolate
that
your results beyond 2020, the welfare and the employment and impact on prices. Yeah. If you were
Yes.
to go beyond your study period, is this one-off, or is it going to be, perpetuated beyond 2020? You have round one, round two. What happened 21, 22, 23, for example? Are you in a position to extrapolate what might happen or what's happening? In other words, I'm interested to know whether there's a one-off impact or will it gradually die down and then that's it. Was it a permanent, also on the impact on the global value chains? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. So round one and round two. So round one like 50 billion US dollar, round two, 20 billion US dollars of Chinese importing goods. So those are the one actually implemented. And there's like a round three coming up. Like round three is like so around like United States imposing tariffs, additional tariffs on about like 300 billion US dollars Chinese imports. But like not all of those 300 are implemented. So like after the phase one deal, you can see like those two countries are actually like in terms of the tariffs are like fluctuated around the tariff level and at the point of the phase one deal. So like China is sometimes adding more goods into the targeting list, and so increase, for example, could increase tariffs from 10% to 25%, and the United States could do like similar things. But like after several months, like those two countries probably like remove some part of the goods from the targeting list or decreasing decreasing the tariffs. So it's like so after the phase one deal, like the tariff level is fluctuating around, like not deviate too much compared to the phase one deal's tariff level. So the majority of those tariffs impact are focusing on the 2 rounds. And after that, the tariffs does not like change too much. But the point is like after the phase one deal, like more sanction is like coming from things other than tariffs, like such as like the technology sanctions and things like that, because of some corporations or firms and in China is actually added into the targeting list of the United States. It's more related to technological sanctions. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. For your results table for your 2 rounds of trade war, just looking at the results right now, it seems that the impact from both round 1 and round 2 is bigger for China in terms of inflation. But on the employment side, the impact is bigger for US, both in terms of losses from downstream employment and gains from upstream employment. Can you just walk us through the intuition behind the results? Why is inflation a bigger impact for China, but employment a bigger impact for the US, both upstream and downstream?
Yes, I mean that is a very good question. So like this is the result I computed from my general equilibrium model. As for like the intuition, I'm not like actually, like, to be honest, I don't have like a very solid answer to explain this. Yeah, I mean, frankly speaking, because like I agree with you. I actually, to be honest, I anticipate like the opposite of it. So I anticipate like the U.S. price index could be like increased more than China, and also since China has comparative advantage on those manufacturing industries, and like there's a lot of substitutable countries in Southeast Asia. So I assume that like the employment impact would be stronger in China. So I mean, my intuition is consistent with your comments, but like this is like the result I get. Maybe it's because like the calibration process, the comparative advantage parameters I'm choosing. So yeah, I have to be frankly with it. Thank you very much.
Can I just suggest that, I mean, it's consistent with a more inelastic upstream supply in China and a more elastic upstream supply in the United States, because then you get bigger employment and smaller price benefits of protection. But the question is also the political economy of it. Why are, these countries imposing so many restrictions that have downstream costs and upstream benefits? I mean, or why are they penalizing their own downstream industries?
Like the political reasons?
Another literature which suggests you have escalating protection, that when you extend protection upstream, then there's pressure for downstream protection and so on. But here your structure of protection, why is the US imposing so many restrictions on the intermediate sector and vice versa?
Oh, okay. So the intuition is because most of the trade nowadays, if you look at trade volume, most of the trade have occurred focused on intermediate goods, and because of the GVC, the global value chain things, we have like intermediate goods like passing through borders like multiple times, so it's going to amplify the impact of tariffs. So like the downstream employers happens to be the downstream industry happens to be the one like hurting the most, because they're gonna bear this multiple time like border crossing intermediate goods. So So like this is like the intuition of why we should particularly protect the downstream employers, because like they bears all the trade cost along the global value chain before them.
So we have time for only one quick question, and then in the meantime, if the next presenter can just set up the ID.
So I was just wondering, these losses that you estimated, you also talked about that this is like a multi-country model. So at the global level, how do the losses stack up in the terms of, other countries which are big gainers, or just like an aggregate welfare loss for the globe?
The global is negative. Like at the global level. So I mean, I also have the rest of the world. So at the global, we sum it up. So at the global level, the entire global economy losses from the trade war. Some countries benefit from that. For example, for Vietnam, like a substitute country, China benefit from it. But at the global level, it's a welfare loss.
So thank you very much, Yang Zhu.
Thank you.
We'll now move on. Thanks a lot. We'll now move on to Laurent Pauls from New York University, Abu Dhabi, to present his work.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here present this paper today. This is joint work with Jean-Yves, whom I've joined in the desert at New York University, Abu Dhabi. I'm currently on leave from the University of Sydney Business School, so I came from the end of the world to the middle of the world. This is recent work that we've done connected to a previous sort of projects that we've had together. And what we aim to do in this paper is to contribute to the already existing and extensive literature on trade sanctions, which, this morning we've heard quite a few papers, mentioning that literature and showing that it's very much alive and at the center of current debate. What we have now is we have, very sophisticated model, general equilibrium model, frontier equilibrium model that enables us to model the consequences of these trade sanctions. And among others, two recent ones are mentioned here. There's Bakay-Fari, but there's also Ho and Levchenko, which allows us to take us off the shelf and simulate what the impact of trade sanctions would be on the economy. And in fact, recently there's been quite a few applications to the Russia's case, so the current war of between Ukraine and Russia. And so there's a couple of papers that make use of this general equilibrium model and give us some idea of what the consequences are for Ukraine and Russia and for the world when sanctions are imposed on Russia. But one recurrent difficulty that's very common with this general equilibrium model is that it requires extensive calibration. And specifically, elasticities of substitution tend to be quite hard to discipline. We've got a long literature that tries to estimate those elasticity of substitution, but they require quite a bit of work and assumptions for us to be able to use them. And this is substitution between inputs, intermediate inputs, so it could be between inputs and all other inputs, or between inputs, intermediate inputs themselves, or final goods. And hence, what we need to usually do is do extensive sensitivity analysis to work out the impact of these choices of elasticities and what they imply in terms of, the impact of response of a trade shock or an embargo as such. And beyond that, there are assumptions that we make in this general equilibrium model, and there are different general equilibrium models, and those models can, we need to run some sensitivity analysis to see what the implications are of choosing some assumptions over others, and what they imply for the impact or the consequences of trade sanctions. And as a result, it's not uncommon to see policymakers and journalists to actually take shortcuts, do back of the envelope calculations, and give us sort of headline figures that's based, typically in this case would be based on direct exports relative to output or relative to GDP, looking at your country in a particular sector that's exporting or importing from the country sector that you want to embargo or impose trade sanctions, and work out what that means actually for your economy. The problem is that, so this is an example here of a recent, headline sort of statistic that's been pulled out to, tells us something about what the impact of trade sanction would be on the EU. The problem with this is that there's no way to know that this is really accurate or if it has anything to do with trade sanctions in the first place. So what we do today is, or what I will present in this is that we want to use this general equilibrium model to infer an empirical or a data-based approximation to the effects of trade sanctions, okay? So what this will allow us to do is basically to bypass the need for extensive calibration and sensitivity analysis on the one hand, and on the other hand, this is going to be akin to a trade exposure type measure, where we're going to take into account both direct but also indirect, effects. And so this is looking at input-output data. We're going to look at input-output linkages, and so everything that's at the higher order and implied by essentially by the value chain. So we can go away from the simple shortcuts or back-of-the-envelope calculations and include some of the higher order linkages, and at the same time not worry too much about the calibration that's required. Now, we are not proposing an alternative. This is really a complement to general equilibrium. This is an empirical complement. This is an improvement on the shortcuts, and not we're not replacing the advantages that general equilibriums provide us, because they provide us with much more flexibility, generally speaking. But we want to show that our approximation will be very close to what general equilibrium can offer. Okay, and so what we'll do, we'll apply this to embargoes on Russian, mostly energy export to the EU, and also we'll do the reverse exercise when we look at an embargo on EU goods that are coming into Russia. And so what we want to do this essentially for two reasons. We want to validate this approximation relative to the exact response that the general equilibrium model would give us, on one hand. And on the other hand, we want to look at what the literature has done and sort of compare our results to literature, and then we'll give also some sort of a practical use of this approximation with some figures that it implies in terms of trade sanctions between Russia and the European Union. So what do we find? Okay, so we find that overall the approximation is pretty close to the exact response for most plausible elasticities of substitution, okay? So this is generally speaking, but this is not true for very, very, very low elasticities of substitution, such as 0.005 or lower, then the exact responses are different from the approximation. But for a wide range of plausible elasticities of substitution, our approximation seems to be doing quite well. And also, we rejoined the literature in showing that actually the impact of trade sanctions are usually quite small. Okay, so that's what this recent literature has found, especially in the case of Russia and Ukraine war, that the embargo had actually small effects overall. So that's not really surprising. We do find that there are strong asymmetries, and so some of it is not surprising, some of it is probably a bit newer. First of all, we find that Russia is much more affected than the EU. Again, this is not really a big surprise, especially on its ban on energy exports from the EU. The EU effects of taking energy from Russia or having a ban on its export is actually relatively small in the aggregate. But when we look at EU member countries, we find that there's actually a very strong asymmetry. So large Western European members, such as France or Germany, are much less affected than, say, the former Soviet satellite countries or countries that are geographically close to Russia and have shared some common history. These countries are much more affected, and they're much more impacted by embargo. And because they're small countries in the aggregate, the EU has a lower impact overall. All right. So so the efficacy of embargo depends on the availability of suppliers or markets. So we do assume a substitutability away in the approximation, and I'll explain this a little bit more in detail when we get to that point. But essentially, what we do, we use this approximation to explore historically existing alternative markets for Russia and for the EU. So specifically, we look at, can Russia or has Russia sold historically to other markets, and what does that represent relative to the EU, right? And this is in terms of the approximation. Again, we'll look at this implication both in direct and indirect sort of paths to find markets. And also, has the EU sourced, different, it flows from different markets, energy, such as oil or gas, in the past, and what does that represent relative to its connection with Russia? So we look at these market alternatives. And again, what we find is that, there's again these strong asymmetries across the results. Russia has some alternatives, but they are much smaller than the EU. So it's quite limited for Russia, for Russian export. We find that across the EU, large economies in the EU already have historical alternative supplies for energy, but the, again, small Eastern European economy seems to be mostly affected, and their alternative markets are much less available to them than for larger European economies. Okay. Okay. So all right, so we show that also that, so one more point here, we show that this happens. The reason why Eastern Europeans are mostly affected is because they're mostly the most integrated in terms of intensity and length of supply chain into the supply chain with the Russian economy. Also, we go on and show that this is also connected to the infrastructure, specifically pipeline infrastructure. And so what we look at is we look at Russian pipelines and the production of electricity in the EU, and we look at how different countries get impacted by this supply with a different data set. Okay, so there's a few things to go through. So I'm going to start with the model. The model is pretty standard. So this is a model from Huo and Levchenko. So we take it off the shelf and we look at what would it mean to have a trade sanction or a change in trade costs. So let me go through a couple of details here to sort of tell you what's going on. So the production, again, is pretty standard. We've got, here we go. So this is materials here, aggregate intermediate inputs, which depends on, this is the input-output data, right? So this is the intermediate trade linkages that we have. The subscript, so below here are the countries, the superscript are the industries. The first one tells us the origin or the source, and the second one tells us the destination where it's sold to. So this is an intermediate input produced in JS, so in country J, sector S, sold to country I, sector R. Okay, so that's the this thing here. We've got elasticities of substitution for final goods and intermediate. So for final goods and intermediate goods. So for intermediate it's epsilon, and for final goods it's rho. It's one elasticity of substitution for all intermediate inputs. It's all CES. Same for final goods. So it's all CES. There's no distinction between energy and other inputs in this model. So it's one thing here. We have a market clearing condition. Again, pretty standard. It tells us, that the output here comes from either final users or intermediate inputs here. We have two market shares, which gives us the allocation. One for final goods, which is pi here, and the XC here gives us the one for intermediate goods. And the idea here is going to be to shock or give a trade shock here at tau. Tau is our trade cost parameter. So you can simulate the model by giving a trade shock, looking at reallocation here in these trade shares according to different types of elasticities. So the epsilon and the rho, we'll look at different values of elasticities. And then that will give us, the response of the model by, using these assumptions, plugging everything into the market condition, the market clearing condition, and then solving the model for the equilibrium. So this is really standard. There's not much, nothing really new here. So the solution that we are getting essentially is, so we get a vector of value-added response. So it's a vector because it's value-added response at country sector level. Okay. And so that basically depends on two things. So we've got nominal output response. So this is a response of nominal output, okay, across country sectors. And it's corrected for so the response of CPI, which is a country level CPI response, okay? And so this endogenous variable here is essentially, as it's a response to trade shocks, and it's defined or determined by this lambda matrix, which is an influence matrix, which captures all the network or the trade effects across the whole global economy in here. Okay. So yes, once again, we'll just compute the shocks, simulate the model, and then get the response. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, I've got to speed up a little bit. So what do we do for the approximation? There's two things here. We're going to assume away the effect of the CPI. So it's going to be atomistic at most. So at first order, it won't matter, the effect of CPI to a trade shock. Our approximation is really short term. It's not a long-term approximation. So that's what will happen here. And then we will look at an empirical approximation here, which is the percentage response of nominal output to an embargo, which is this guy here, this term here that will approximate. So we have so first of all, how do we do this? Well, we've got two candidate approximation, right? So we're going to use this hypothetical extraction, and we have two candidate approximation, one upstream and one for downstream. So if we start with the downstream measure here, we've got, so this matrix A here is the input-output data. It's the direct requirement matrix. And what we'll do is, so this is, again, this is a nominal output as a function of the final use at different order. So you have a higher order here because it's captured by the Leontief inverse. And so this is part here is nominal output minus, this is the first term, and the second term is essentially this A matrix here that's been modified. So we put actually values in this A matrix to 0 that corresponds to the country sector that's being embargoed. So it's all the other countries, as usual, without the countries and sectors essentially that are being embargoed here relative to total nominal output here. Okay, so we call this hot. This is higher order trade, right? And symmetrically, we do another measure, which is, which we call short source higher order trade. So this is really pretty much symmetric here. Now we're looking at, again, this matrix B. This is the allocation matrix. This part here is, again, nominal output as, coming from primary factors at, all levels, so a higher order as well. Again, we have a Leontief inverse here that gives us, so the value chain, so all the higher order connections. And similarly here, we are going to modify B so that we can remove all the inputs that are coming from the sector country that's being embargoed. And so we can look at the difference between these two, and that will give us the approximate response to a trade embargo in this case here. Okay, so So this is what we consider. We could consider a few scenarios. So we're going to consider an embargo on Russian exports into the EU, right? And then we look at the EU value-added response to this, not having inputs from Russia. So this is the shot measure that I mentioned earlier. And then we look at what the impact is, for Russia. Basically, we'll look at, how Russian exports, direct and indirectly are being affected by this embargo, and that's captured by HOT. And then we do the reverse sort of exercise where we are embargoing European exports to Russia. And again, we have two measures. So this means, the downstream shock. So for the EU, so we look at the EU value-added response to this embargo, which is captured by HOT. And again, we look at the Russian value-added response from not getting any inputs from Russia, and that's captured by SHOT. So I don't have much time, but this is basically, there's a few things here that I want to quickly mention. So in yellow, you have the exact model response. In black, you have our approximation, which is flat across different elasticities of substitution. You can see that generally speaking, I want to very quickly summarize that the exact response of the model is relatively flat across different elasticities and for the given assumptions. And so for plausible elasticity, except for very, very low ones, the approximation actually is quite close to the model's exact response. So you have an example here. Approximate response here is 1.33%, decrease here. And this is the average of that surface, yellow bluish surface. That's 1.3%. That's what the exact model would imply. And you can see that the impact on Russia is much larger than the EU, which is much lower here in this particular case. Again, we are relatively close to this. Now we reverse. We look at an embargo on European exports. So we're looking at again the two responses from the EU and from Russia. And again, here the surface is relatively flat, except for very, very low level of elasticity. So we actually do quite well. So in practice, what we want to do is we want to look at what the approximation means in terms of putting embargoes on specific Russian energy or European exports. And in order to give you a number for country or at sector level, we have to sort of aggregate this up or average this up. And we do this with value-added weights, essentially. So we can do this at the country level. At the sector level for shots, this is the upstream measure. And then the downstream measure, we can do this with HOT. Okay. So a few things here. I don't have a lot of time, but just so the effects of Russia is on the left side. The effect on Europe. This is the EU aggregated sectors. So the top 10 sectors that are most affected in Russia, in the EU, and then the top 10 most affected countries in here. Okay. So you can see that this short-term effect here is 1.3% of GDP in aggregate for Russia, whereas for European Union it's only 0.08. The thing that I want to highlight here is that the Eastern European economy seems to be the most affected by this embargo on Russian energy. How do we compare to the literature? The literature has a decrease in 0.6% of GDP for Russia. This is lower than ours, but ours is really a short-term measure, whereas this is a long-term estimation. Okay. Again, here we're looking at all exports. This is pretty much the same as before, except that the number increased quite substantially. I think what I'll say is that again, the list of countries that are most affected are the same as before, mostly Eastern European or small economies. Again, we join up quite well with the literature. Again, this 1.06% here is a long-run effect, whereas we provide a short-term impact. And again, the impact on Germany here is very similar to the impact on the overall EU in this case. Okay, so we also look at the impact of banning EU exports here. Again, this is the most affected sectors in Russia. The most affected economies are, again, the Eastern European economy. So this is a recurrent thing. You can see that the impacts are actually overall quite small. Okay, so one of the things we do, if I can take a couple more minutes, we look at the availability of alternatives. Like I mentioned, we don't have substitution with this approximation. So what we look at historical alternatives. Were there other countries supplying energy to the European Union? Which one are those? What are the markets for Russia outside of the European Union? What it represents? Okay, so we're going to compute shares of production that historically served alternative markets or use alternative inputs as a share of its total output within that particular sectors. Again, here, this is for Russia. So this is for Russian exports. We look at petroleum, specifically energy sectors and all Russian sectors. You can see that basically, refined petroleum products from Russia exports, directly and indirectly. It's very important. Both measures together a substantial amount relative, for example, to the US, which is 5 times smaller. Okay, so the EU, there are markets, alternative markets for Russia, such as China here, but they are half the size of what Europe is, or the US, for example, which is 1/5 of the size overall. Again, we're looking at the impact of Europe on Europe here. We took 4 countries, 2 large ones, France and Germany, usual suspects, I guess, and then we took, quite randomly, we could have taken other countries, Latvia and Bulgaria. Here, the point is, electricity and gas seem in France uses 1.82% relative to its overall output in electricity, gas, and steam that comes from Russian energy. And you can see that it imports, so it takes more inputs even from Saudi Arabia and a little bit less from Kazakhstan. And for Germany, you have Norway and Kazakhstan as alternative, which are larger than Russia. Okay. Whereas in the case of Latvia and Bulgaria here, we can see that they heavily depend on Russia. So they're very integrated with, the length and intensity of the supply chain for these countries, connected to Russia is very, very large, very important. You can see that the source of alternatives for Latvia and Bulgaria is almost non-existent in here. They depend, heavily on Russian energy. Okay, so why is this? Well, we computed basically the ratio of direct, indirect to direct exports. So that ratio tells us the bigger it is, the more important the indirect effects are. Right? The smaller it is, the closer it is to 1, the closer it is to just direct exports and no indirect exports whatsoever. And so this tells us, the length and the intensity of the value chain. And so that tells us here that, Czech Republic here is heavily integrated with Russia. Same for the other eastern and smaller economies in Europe. You can see that the numbers are very large, and so they're part of that very long and very intensive supply chain with Russia. And so, they're more integrated and more dependent. So that's one thing. The other thing that we do, this is the last thing, and then I'll stop, is we explore the importance of transport infrastructure, especially pipeline infrastructure in Europe, and we look at what it implies for production of electricity in European countries. So we're looking at, Russian transport via pipeline as IR and JS is any European countries in production of electricity and gas. We use this Exio base in 2021. It's much more granular for this sort of things. Again, here very quickly, what we show essentially is that, the Eastern European economies with former satellite sort of countries of the Soviet Union are very much integrated in the infrastructure with Russia, and this explains why they are so dependent. Okay, so very quickly conclude. So we provide a database approximation to the effect of trade embargo. There's no substitution and therefore no elasticity to calibrate. Obviously, it's not a replacement for general equilibrium. Okay, we just provide a better empirical sort of approximation than rules of thumbs or just very quick shortcuts. We basically document the effect of the embargo involving Russia, and we show that it's quite asymmetric overall. Hopefully, we've illustrated the approximation's potential, and we intend to make this sort of simulations, also this approximation available online through our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor now. Sergio?
No, we have not. It's a good point, actually, evasion. So alternative countries are taking up the slack that would come from from Russia or from Europe to exports or imports things. It's a very good point. It's the approximation is really short-term, impact that's available in the historical data. So there's no avenue for substitution and no avenue for leakages. I mean, I don't know if this would clarify this as leakages, but yes, it's a very good point. I think this merits further investigation, because so long term, also the question is, how much does substitution matter more than the actual sort of evasion of these sanctions. I think that's still up for debate. So that's a very good question. Thank you.
So I'm a bit confused on the elasticity of substitution. Is it that you couldn't calibrate the elasticity of substitution, so you concluded that there is no substitution? Or the assumption was that there is no substitution, hence you couldn't calibrate?
Okay, so basically, yep. I'll go to a slide so that's probably easier. So when we do when we do this here, we set a sector country to 0, which is being embargoed. So if EU embargoes Russia energy, then it's 0 for all inputs of energy that comes into the European Union from Russia. And in that sense, there is no substitution. So that's what we mean by there's no substitution available. There's no possibilities for Russia or EU in that sort of framework to actually substitute away so the approximation doesn't take into account substitution. It cannot.
So meaning there is no need calibrating for the elasticity, there is no substitution.
No, that's correct. That's correct. And the calibration of elasticity of substitution goes into the general equilibrium model. And as I've mentioned very quickly, these tend to be relatively flat overall. And so, for most plausible, it seems that the approximation is actually quite okay, except if you have extreme sort of elasticity of substitution in that particular model,
So if there were to be substitution and you were to calibrate the elasticity of substitution, will it be per sector-wise or per product in this case?
That's right.
I mean, if there were to be
Yeah.
substitution and you were to calibrate for the elasticity of substitution, are you going to do it per sector-wise in this case?
No, so you can't do it in the approximation, right? So there's no way to approximate, so to do any calibration. So it's only in the model that you can calibrate. And so, but this model here assumes one elasticity of substitution for all inputs, regardless of the sector it comes from. So that's yes, that's just a general CES function for all inputs.
There are two views on sanctions. One is sanctions are effective in punishing countries.
Yes.
The other is sanctions are useless, as pointed out from your study. So is it true to say that sanctions are imposed mainly for non-economic reasons? There's so many alternatives you can substitute. I mean, India buying fuel from Russia and China as well, increasing purchases from China. So that's point number one. Sanctions are imposed mainly for non-economic reasons, and it's very, very difficult to quantify. The others apply this model to say smaller countries like Myanmar, so the outcome would be a lot different. I mean, Russia is a huge country, relatively developed. For poorer countries, sanctions can have a bigger impact on the economy.
Yeah, okay. So good. Yeah, so non-economic reason, I think that makes sense, right? So it's politically motivated as a sort of really, it's almost diplomatic relations needs to be severed in some way. So you impose these economic sanctions, which show that don't have much impact, but yet they have non-economic impact. So I think I agree with that. I don't like, as you said, it's very difficult to quantify. So it would be very difficult to work out really what it achieves. Maybe it has some political achievements that would be that would come out in some ways, but yes, purely economically, it's very limited. The other one is on smaller countries. Yes, we are just doing this on the European Union. It looks like small countries are more affected, but in this particular case, I would have to qualify this in that we find that It's not just the size of the country or the relative income of the country, because these small countries tend to have a slightly lower income than some of the larger economies in the European Union, but it's also your integration in the value chain. So how much you're connected into the value chain, how intensive is the value chain that you're in, and how connected you are. And in the European case, it's even more specific because there is also infrastructure that's involved. But generally speaking, just the connection in sort of integration in value chain would be important. So if you're a completely isolated country, I'm not sure that you're much less likely to be affected by these sanctions than if you are actually maybe small, poor, but quite integrated, quite dependent on.
Sorry, very interesting. A question on this. These were two unilateral embargoes, right?
Yes.
So you could look also at the war episodes, right, where the two
yes.
are actually doing the same. This is a new calculation you need to do, like with your approximation, right? It's not exactly what you showed.
Yes. So it's a good point. I didn't spend much time on the data. The headline we produce is from ICO OECD 2018. The pipelines we look at before the war, so 2021, we have data on that.
No, but even just this slide, right? So you are considering embargo on Russia into EU without a reaction, right? Without a retaliation. So it's two unilateral hypotheses. Okay.
Yes.
It would be interesting also to see that when both do the same thing, right? When
right. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. That's a fair point. That's
it's just an interesting
exercise
to do.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
The question. So great presentation, great paper. Thank you. Just building off Tokpa's observation, I was kind of intrigued by your finding that diminished exports from Russia to EU hurt it more than diminished imports to Russia. And I was wondering what your time horizon is, or maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, because the impact of diminished imports arguably could be more severe because it leads to degradation, to less technology coming in, whereas for exports, you can diversify markets. So China, India stepping into the game. It's much more difficult for Russia to diversify its imports unless it relies heavily on China, but that's a geopolitical consideration. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a good point. So this is why I really have to insist that the approximation is really short term. So what you talked about technology transfer, it's very relevant. You're right, of course, but this would be much more medium to long term sort of impact. So we can't capture this immediately. So this would be more of a requires sort of long term or more medium term sort of impact. So it's definitely a very good point to look into. But again, that might be more suited for more fleshed out models that look at long run consequences with substitutability taking into account, right? So yeah, thank you.
Just a thought on expanding a little bit on the political effects or the potential political effects. These approximations, they give you a sort of an approximate treatment effect. And you can just collect social survey data from ESS or Gallup poll and take that as a baseline and imagine two countries that share a border, but they have different treatment effects. And there are questions about their views in Russia or the effectiveness of the EU. So you can get some proxies and think in a very short window, pre and post, get some measures about the political consequences of these based on your approximations. And I think that could be a cheap exercise to sort of validate the potential consequences.
Okay, good point. I might talk to you afterwards for this survey data. But thank you.
Yes. So may I suggest a reference? It's called Trade War and Peace: How to Impose International Trade Sanctions.
Yes.
So the co-authors are me, myself, and Gustavo Souza at Chicago Fed, and Yuan Mei and Na Yuan Hu at Singapore Management University. So in that paper, we study, optimal, sanctions imposed by, countries under different willingness to pay for sanctions. I think it's sort of related. So, I mean, I was wondering, like, in this paper, we do a, first order approximation. I mean, in your work, I mean, how good is it in terms of, approximating, different, elasticities of substitution across sectors and across countries? And when we think about, embargo, I think is a pretty large deviation from the steady state, right? So with that, I'm not sure, like, could you, discuss a bit on this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, maybe afterwards you can give me the reference, so I can be happy to have a look at it. So thanks for that. Yes. So essentially, again, this is a short-term approximation, right? So for different elasticities, we tend to show that actually the model that we're using, this general equilibrium model, and the approximation are actually quite close, except for very extreme sort of elasticities of substitution. So there are limitations, obviously, to this. But overall, in the exercise that we do, we only show about 4 exercises here, but we've run several others, and they all seem to agree that actually it doesn't. So the elasticities of substitution, for plausible range are okay. Now you're mentioning elasticities for different sectors. So here it's one elasticity of substitution for intermediate inputs and one for final goods. So this is CES. What would it mean if you had, different elasticities of substitution, let's say for energy products versus manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not sure. The model doesn't really accommodate this. I'm sure it's a very interesting question. Hopefully your approximation says, you can do away with that in sort of at the first order as a short term. Obviously, if you're looking at for again, medium to long run impacts, and getting a more accurate pictures, then obviously, going to this detail might be useful. But we haven't really gotten into this detail. So yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we are almost out of time. So maybe we can have discussion afterwards with Lauren if anyone else has a question.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you to all our speakers. We will now have a short coffee break. We unfortunately have to shorten it to 20 minutes. So we'll reconvene back here at 11:30. So everyone.
And then I give it back to you.
Okay, then keep it unchanged. Like that. Keep it simple. I'll ask if there's anything to ask.
Yeah, there's one.
Yeah, otherwise, okay.
Everything goes.
Yeah, they save, yeah, right.
Follow one, I have one.
You have the whole style of the flag.
Yes.
And I. No.
It's good, no problem.
So that's the problem.
I checked all the flights, all the remaining flights for the day. I think that yes, modeling your family.
But once you like push that Chinese conditions.
Yeah, I think I've got a big picture what they're trying to do the populations. It's sort of side. I think the problem found that send me some kind of about one. But yeah, it's as to kind of to national all this thing. Yeah, so I really got the sex.
The only thing that I would have.
Why every retiree should consider starting a lifestyle business and generate an income without risking a lot of capital. Did you know that at
These are fake pockets.
Should be okay. Okay. So what's the sound? Okay. Thank you. So with this, I go forward. With this, I go back, right? Okay. And this is perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yes. So you go forward, and this one is back, and this one is laser. I think this symbol is my favorite. And this is like also it has some instructions.
Not used during penalty kicks.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice short coffee break. So we will go on ahead and move to our second session on uh, production networks, global production networks. And in this session, we will have two presenters, starting with Nuria Melissa Begin from Bocconi University, followed by Piyush Panigrahi from Johns Hopkins University, who will be presenting virtually. As before, a total of 40 minutes are allocated to each paper, with 20 minutes of it being on the presentation, followed by an open discussion. We request an uninterrupted 5-minute start to the presentation, after which participants are welcome to ask clarifying questions during the presentation and keep detailed questions until afterwards. For YouTube participants, please post your questions in the chat and we will ask them at an opportune time. Another quick announcement, if you need Wi-Fi, there is a QR code you can scan by the door, so just to get connection. And also on the table, you will see QR codes, which you can quickly scan for a quick survey. Without further ado, please welcome Nuri.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nuriye Melisabigin, and today I will be presenting endogenous production networks and supply chain disruptions. The motivation is quite simple. So we have seen the Russian-Ukrainian war, trade wars, also pandemic-related lockdowns, and now we are becoming familiar with the increase in cost of living, inflation, goods waiting at ports. So in this paper, I basically ask, how do supply chains affect prices and productivity at the firm level, at the micro level? And I answer this question in 3 ways using empirical, theoretical, and quantitative methods. So on the empirical part, I exploit the disruption from Chinese suppliers on Turkish firms to provide a causal estimate on prices and productivity. And I find that the disruptions in the supply chains would lead to 11% increase in the prices and 20% decrease in the labor productivity. And I also show that these suppliers, even at the micro level, are actually not substitutes, complements in production. On the second part, I build a model. The model would show the endogenous formation of production networks, and I show that there would be a selection in the supply chains. Better firms would have better supply chains, and relatively worse firms would depend on the relatively worse suppliers. And I show that if there is a shock hit to these supply chains, it will have effects on both intensive and extensive margins. On the third part, I take model to the data, and I shock the model, and I build some counterfactual analysis by using some counterfactual supply chains and some shocks to mimic this disruption. So for the literature, now we are becoming familiar with the networks case. We see that if there's a shock comes in, and if these sectors or firms are linked with some input-output linkages, these shocks would propagate, and they have some aggregate implications. Also, now there's a recent emerging literature that shows the endogenous formation of production networks, which show that if there's a new technology or new industry, these formation of these production networks become endogenous, or with the firm entry and exit. But the formation of these endogenous production networks in this paper would depend on the interdependent choices between different suppliers. Also, for the production networks and trade literature, I show that the papers, Demir and Alfa Urena et al. Shows that there is some learning through these suppliers or customers in the production networks. Different than, I show that these networks are formed by the selection process. Firms select into better suppliers or better production networks, and these supply chains are not formed randomly. So basically, what's a supply chain? We have 2 firms, firm A, which is a supplier, and firm B, which is a customer. And these A and B would be the nodes in the production networks, and they trade, their trade would be the intermediate inputs. So imagine a very large number of these transactions, then they will build up the sub-production networks. So data in this paper comes from the Turkish manufacturing firms starting from 2006 to 2020. And these networks are weighted and directed depending on the VAT statements of the firms. So if the transaction between 2 firms exceeds $270, then they have to report these transactions to the Minister of Finance. And each of these transactions would be a new edge in the network. So I built these production networks with the VAT data, and then I match them with the firm's customs information, their imports, what they trade, and who they are trading. same for the exports. And then I also merge with the balance sheet and social security data. So first fact, new to the literature, I show that productive firms have actually productive supply chains. The x-axis shows the productivity of the firm. It's a TFP measure estimated with Levinson and Patron. And y would be the average firm productivity of its suppliers. So more productive firms have more productive suppliers. So there is some productive clusters in the supply chain. And second, this is not new to the literature, but only a small percentage of firms rely on different suppliers. So there might be some costs to find the supplier. Otherwise, we would expect a different distribution to minimize to maximize the diversification across network. So first, how the productivity and supply chain productivity is linked. So suppose this is the network, B is the firm, and we have some several A's, which are the input suppliers, and there are some several C's, which are the customers of the firm. So we can calculate the network productivity of the supplier side by, if we weight these suppliers by their inputs, or for the customer side, we can use the sales and run basically an OLS. So these OLS estimates show that there is a significant and positive association between the productivity of supplier set and the customer set. But this is only a correlation, and we cannot answer how supply chains affect prices and productivity, and we can't find a mechanism. So the challenge then is to find an identification mechanism strategy. So best way to come up with a causal estimate is exploiting the disruption from Chinese suppliers during the lockdown. So the main identifying assumptions would be this supply chain disruption can be employed as exogenous event for all of the firms. And firms importing from China and firms importing from other countries have no differential trends absent the Chinese lockdown. They are performing same. Then we can use this treated group as the importers from China in 2019 and the remaining importers as a control group. So this is the basic difference and difference design. Disruption would be the take 0 and 1 depending on the Chinese supplier. And the first estimation would calculate the price levels of the firms. So first, price effects. Before the lockdown, we see that there is no difference. But after this lockdown, the firms that rely on Chinese suppliers will increase their prices relative to others. And this increase more than 11%. So if we do some robustness check, it will be same for the all industries, also same for the only manufacturing industries. And the last columns would show that since we know that what they are importing from the HS code, we can divide them into 3 categories. If they import intermediate goods, capital goods, and final goods. In each case, they will have the same price increase. But what about the productivity? What is the underlying mechanism, how it is related? So if we calculate basically labor productivity by dividing the sales per labor, we see that more than 25% decrease in the labor productivity. But the main mechanism is driven by this part. Firms that import final goods would not significantly expose to a decrease in their labor productivity. But firms that rely on intermediate goods or machinery would experience more than 40% of decrease in their labor productivity. So that must be the mechanism. So model. So what we see that there are some productive clusters in the network, and these supply chain disruptions would lead to increase in the prices, but decrease in the labor productivity. But this labor productivity is mainly driven by the imports of machinery or intermediate goods. So I build to guide this analysis, I build a model that I show that there is a selection into supply chains, and we can test the predicted effects with this model. So this is the summary of the model. There is a firm, final good producer, which chooses its supplier. It can go with the average supplier, or it can go with the supplier that provides some cheaper intermediate inputs or productive ones. But this cost N1 and N2 would be different. Firms that can only afford to go with the productive cheap suppliers would have higher met-specific productivity to produce their final goods. So we have CS preferences, but the main focus would be the manufacturing part. So suppose there are two types of firms. Upstream suppliers that provide intermediate inputs to the final good producers, and the final good producers that produce final goods. These would be the downstream firms, but they operate in different markets. So first one would be operating upstream suppliers in the perfectly competitive classical eaten and cotton markets. And the second one would be the modeled as a MELS type firm. So these downstream firm, final good producer, have different productivity levels. Then these upstream firms would draw their efficiency from the fresh air distribution with different location parameters. And these downstream firms would draw their efficiency from the Pareto distribution with same shape and location parameter. So then what would be the difference? There would be some sourcing cost with the supplier to go with the productive or the cheaper one. So it would be different for each supplier, and that's how the firms are forming their input-output linkages. So in that case, the better suppliers are the ones that quote lower prices, and they are associated with the higher sourcing cost. Most probably Chinese suppliers for Turkey. So in this case, there would be a self-selection of better firms or efficient firms to cheaper suppliers, and the remaining firms would source from worse suppliers. So the problem would be downstream firms first draw their potential supplier and decide whom to supply from, and then they will make the production decision. So this decision would depend on the marginal cost and the maximization of the profits. So again, classically, it will come from the fresh air distribution. These final good producers want to match with upstream suppliers that are more productive, or they want to increase their suppliers, number of suppliers, expand their network. Because they have two options. They can increase the technology of the supplier, or they want to decrease the variation in the productivity by expanding their networks. So basically, the price of the downstream firm would have this equation. Phi, the more productive downstream firm would charge lower prices, and for the and then J are the upstream indices, the firms that which have more productive suppliers or suppliers that have lower input costs would charge lower prices. So the price would.
Sorry, this is a clarifying question. So you have that the more productive firms are attached to more productive suppliers, but that may also increase their own productivity. So how do you, in equilibrium, what's forcing firms equilibrium there? So because there's a feedback from productive suppliers to your own productivity, right? So do you run into this problem of all firms? How is it about something about parameter space that makes it stable? How is it stable, basically? That's the question.
So they have different fixed costs to pay and go for the more productive ones. But for their own productivity, they already have the differences in their own productivity.
Okay, thanks.
So the profit of the downstream firm would have this expression. IIJ would be the indicator function. BI would be the demand. So this equation would make the endogenous production networks, because this is not nonlinear and non-separable profit function. So each of these downstream firms that produce final goods should make their decision based on the whole supply chains, whole suppliers, not one by one. So that makes the production network interdependence. And there would be a unique industrial equilibrium. So we have the model, we have the empirical results, but how to model these supply chain disruptions? As suppliers have their fixed cost, probability of these best suppliers for Turkish firms are the Chinese ones because they have the lower factor cost, better state of art. Also, they are associated with higher sourcing costs. So in the case of these supply chain disruptions, all firms would be affected because there would be changes in the different fixed costs and there would be a new reconfiguration of the manufacturing industry. So we can model it as a disruption, as an increase in the fixed costs. So in this disruption would have several effects. First, the fixed costs are increasing. The better firms are not sourcing as much from the Chinese suppliers. So these better firms' network, supply network, would be similar to the ones that have worse suppliers. So it will decrease the competition in the Turkish market. So in that case, there would be two reasons to increase the prices. First, basically inputs are more expensive. And second, there will be less efficient due to the weaker selection. So we have this model, and to make some counterfactual scenarios, I calibrate the model with the firm level data, and then by using the simulated method of moments, I calculate the fixed cost of these suppliers. So the calibration comes from the firm level data and some sources. First, we can differently calculate the supplier advantage by using the imports of the firms. So firms that have countries that have higher sourcing potential is associated with higher number of firms, except one case, Iran. So they have higher sourcing potential, but not many firms go there for the fear of sanctions. And these productivity dispersion and demand elasticity numbers comes from the firm level data. And I estimate with the fixed cost with the simulated method of moments. And I see that this model does a good job by replicating this microdata and sourcing strategies. So first, counterfactual scenario. Since we have the model, now we can shock the model. We have the supply chains of the firms. Now what can we do? First part would be the exogenously by changing the fixed cost of these countries. So first one, I impose fixed cost of Turkey to each country, which means no tariffs. So what will happen in Turkey? The price would go down. There would be much increasing the number of importers to each also for each country. But what will happen for the China case? If I impose fixed cost of China to each country, including Greece, then the price in Turkey would increase. There are less firms importing from different destinations, but only firms would switch from China to Taiwan to US with the same fixed cost. And the third one would be Greece, assuming that it will have the lower fixed cost. What will happen? Then the price in Turkey would decrease. More firms would go to import from China, Taiwan, or US, but less firms would go to Greece to import. So there could be some second counterfactual. We can mimic this disruption by increasing the fixed cost from China. In this case, firms would also have some shift from China to South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And there would be adjustments in the importers. So these findings also have some critical policy implications. First one, we see that at the firm level, firms increase their price by 11%. Even it's a micro finding, we know that now the economies are linked with some granular networks and supply chains. So there would be some propagation and some aggregate effects. And the second, I show that for the Turkish firms, the labor productivity is mainly driven by the imports of low-cost capital. So it also has some critical implications for shaping industrial policies. And third, this framework can be used to understand this diffusion of inflation or the intuition for the globalization trade. So to conclude, first, I show that there are some productive clusters in the production networks. Some parts are much more productive and associated with productive suppliers. And with the model, I show that there would be some selections of the production networks. These networks are not formed randomly. Also, there is no learning. There's actually a selection mechanism. And on the third part, with the counterfactual scenarios, I show that these changes in the fixed cost would have also important implications for the aggregate price in Turkey, percentage of importers. Also, it will have some third country effects.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor for questions now.
I have a question. According to your perception, okay, what will be your suggestions to make supply chain much more effective in these highly uncertain times, especially in Southeast Asia? What kind of large pinpoints do you have based on that?
So I find that the prices would go down if we allow no tariffs. So that would, my suggestion would be the decrease in these fixed costs. It could be tariffs or the iceberg cost, any kind of cost that's associated with the integration of supply chains. I would be the decrease on them to both for these aggregate prices, also the imports, percentage of imports.
This is Fabian Vera. Good presentation. In your conclusions, you mentioned that this first paper tells about a new layer of firm heterogeneity for supply chains. Which can be the limitations or any self-awareness that you realized through your journey, and which can be the work moving forward?
For what?
Your work moving forward, and which can be the self-awareness or limitations of this recommendation?
For this first would be the for the price, I will take the inflation part or the diffusion of prices to show that there would be these differences may drive these changes in the outputs. Also, it can be across sectors, but mostly for the across countries maybe.
When you talk about, better firms select into better, cheaper suppliers, so your initial motivation was these productivity clusters, but you observe the productivity of the Turkish firms, but you only observe the price of the Chinese firm. And so there might be quality differences and so on. So how do we know that the firms, that the Chinese firms from which the productive Turkish firms are sourcing are indeed, have higher quality adjusted productivity?
Exactly. I don't have a direct evidence, but I try to capture this with by matching firm and HS product at the granular level to track the firm by assuming that it will keep the quality same. But I can't observe, are they changing these Chinese supplies, maybe more productive? I can't observe.
And the disruption, you're exploiting the COVID disruption in 2020. So it was a temporary shock. China recovered much faster than any other place. I thought you also presented some results on the durability of the effect of the shock. In the sense you looked at whether the shock effect persisted in time. Why would they persist? Because if you were dependent on China, it was the first country to get back into production and supply. So what was the reason? Were these relationships durably broken, or were they revived after China came back on the market?
So I assume that at this part, I'm increasing the fixed cost and I keep at the same. Like the pandemic, similar to the pandemic, it happened and it will be remaining at the same. But it would be a good idea. Can keep the increases fixed cost and then decrease gradually and see then what happens.
So I'm curious about this. It's a related question on this decline in productivity. So what do you think is happening at the company level when they lose a supplier? So they lose a supplier, and then suddenly the next month they're less productive. And so, what do you think is happening in that story? Like, I can understand an output drop, but it's harder for me to reconcile why suddenly like their loss of one supplier means that for every given unit of input they're getting less output. So what do you think is like happening at the micro level?
So I think they cannot, they cannot easily substitute these suppliers.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their productivity should fall, right?
Right. It's labor productivity.
Oh, so this productivity measure here is labor productivity. I see. I see. It's not TFP.
Exactly. So I have. So at this first stage for the productivity, there is no significant effects 1 month after the shock. I assume that that might be due to the inventory. I don't have an inventory information data. But I think after this, these differences would be depending on the inventories. But after 2 months, they start to decrease.
If I could offer some answer Amit's question in terms of productivity and inventory and what that means, I think part of the challenge here is that we're looking at this on a sectoral basis. If you look at it on a firm level basis, like using say shipment data from the into US, like these bill of lading data, what's really notable is that you have a notable decline in the number of suppliers due to COVID. So on an aggregate level, you see this drop in the number of suppliers. But on a granular level, those that have remaining supplier relationships, they ramp up their inventory. So they basically boost their productive capacity. They basically ramp up their production with the given capacity in place. And what we saw was that those that have stayed in business shipped a lot more. So which might explain part of this movement that you see in terms of productivity X months after disruption. Just an observation.
Just a clarifying question on like this, that type of nature. Why the choice of modeling the disruption as increase in fixed cost as opposed to alternative approaches?
So I thought at first that there must be some differences to reach these suppliers. So since these suppliers have some different costs, so I try to model it as these better Chinese firms to increase them, to not to reach them, to try to be mimic the pandemic.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. If there's no, we'll move on to Piyush now, who will present virtually.
Am I all right?
Yeah, we can see your slides now.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right, so hello everyone, I'm Piyush Panigrahi, and I thank the organizers for including my paper on this wonderful conference. And I'm very delighted to present my work, which is endogenous spatial production networks. The motivation for this paper is a very common fact that we see in the real world, which is that large firms play a pivotal role in the economic impact of any kind of policy. So if you think of trade policy as reducing trade barriers, it is the response of large firms that mostly determine the aggregate consequences. And another fact about large firms is that large firms tend to sell more and to more markets than smaller firms. For example, here I have a graph of the number of markets that different size of firms reach from Indian firm-to-firm network data. And so here, if you look at the group of firms that sell to maybe 0 to 5 markets, you have a lot of firms that are in the lower deciles in terms of their sales distribution. But if you look at the group of firms that sell to more than 30 markets or so, you mostly see firms which are in the top decile. Now, these firms, they operate in large-scale complex networks. So production in modern economies consists of a large number of firms trading intermediate inputs with each other. And so they're called global value chains at a global scale, or also spatial production networks within the country and across space. Now, a lot of this trade in intermediate trade is essentially trade between firms. So firm-to-firm trade underlies much of the trade that we see across space, whether it be across countries or within countries. So with this in mind, in this paper, I asked 2 questions. The first is, how does the network structure of production or firms' participation in production network shape their dispersion in size? So firms exhibit vast dispersion in size in terms of how much they sell to other firms. And the first question is, what can we learn about their participation in the production network that influences their size dispersion? The second question that I ask in this project is, how do changes in spatial frictions to trade? So these firms, they're not located at one point in space. They're located at different points in space. How do changes in changes in frictions to trade across different locations affects the network structure of production and also eventually the firm size dispersion? To give you a preview of the result, to answer the first question, I use firm-to-firm transactions microdata from Indian VAT records. And I find that endogenous network formation, which is firms choosing who their suppliers are and how much to source from them, accounts for over 80% of the variation that we see in firm size dispersion across the distribution. Now, to answer the second question, which is how changes in spatial frictions to trade affect the network structure and hence firm size dispersion, I develop a tractable model of network formation between spatially distant firms. So this is going to be a model where firms that are located in different points in space decide which firm and at which location they're going to source their inputs from endogenously. And I complement the model with a scalable framework for structural estimation and counterfactual analysis. So typically, these are models with millions of firms taking independent decisions. And so estimation can sometimes be difficult. And so here I present a scalable framework where you can estimate such a model for any number of firms. And using the estimated model, I evaluate the impact of market integration following India's 2017 GST tax reform. So for those who are uninitiated, in 2017, the Indian government abolished its previous VAT tax system that led to regional segregation of production to roll out a pan-national VAT reform that was supposed to mitigate frictions to trade within the country and unify the whole country as a single market. And so I consider a removal of border frictions for trade across Indian states. And I find that through the lens of the model, it leads to significant reorganization of the spatial production network in India. And as a result of this kind of market integration exercise, the dispersion and connectivity of firms across the network increases. So, more connected firms become even more connected, and less connected firms become even less connected. But at the same time, I also find that there's a reduction in the dispersion in firm size. So even though more connected firms become more connected, they eventually lose out in terms of overall sales for other reasons. And so over half of the variation in these changes, whether it be in connectivity or firm size dispersion, is driven by endogenous network changes. That is, firms choosing who to source inputs from and how much to source from them. So this paper is related to 3 strands of literature, as Nuri has already pointed out, so it makes it easier for me. So The first strand of literature is the group of models that model endogenous production networks. So this is, and relative to this literature, I provide an empirically tractable model that can be feasibly estimated for large number of firms, and also by including spatial frictions to trade or within country frictions to trade. And it relates to the literature that studies shocks to network economies. And here, relative to that, I accommodate endogenous network changes in response to shocks. Now, the paper also relates to a long line of literature on firm heterogeneity. And relative to this literature, I study heterogeneity arising from engagement in input-output linkages and furthermore across space. So this is not, a single location model. Okay. So the data for this project comes from the universe of firm-to-firm transactions across 5 Indian states. So these 5 Indian states consist of 141 districts. So I'm going to build a model of trade between districts in India. And the data runs for 5 years, 2011 to 2016. It covers over 2.5 million firms with 103 million firm-to-firm connections between them. Now, this data comes from 6 parts. We have 5 within state firm-to-firm transactions data set and 1 cross-state firm-to-firm transactions from the federal government. So put together, this data consists of the complete production network of firms in these 5 states in India. And these 5 states account for roughly 40% of India's GDP in the last year of the data. And there's a lot of diversity in terms of the states that are there in the sample. So we have rich and poor states versus near and farther states as well. So there's sufficient spatial diversity as well as economic diversity in the group of states here. Yeah. So the first thing that I learned from this data set is that larger firms, they tend to have more buyers. So here we have the red firm, which has 4 buyers, and the blue firm, which has 2 buyers. And so on average, the red firms are larger than the blue firms. And the number of buyers margin explains around 35% of the variation in the variation of the sales across firms. The second thing that I find is that larger firms also tend to be used more intensively by their buyers. So here on the left, you see a red firm, which has 4 customers, and it accounts for 50% of its customers' cost shares, right? So it's an important supplier to its customers. And on the right-hand side, you have a blue firm, which again has 4 customers, but it only accounts for 10% of its customers' cost share. So what I find in the data is that these red firms tend to be larger than the blue firms, in the sense that firms which are more important to their buyers are also typically larger on average. And this margin, which is the average intensity of use across buyers, accounts for another 46% of the variation in sales across firms. And the third margin is that larger firms also tend to have larger buyers. So here I have a red firm, which sells to a lot of bigger firms, whereas the blue firm, which again sells to 4 smaller firms. And on average, these red firms again tend to be larger than the blue firms. And this last margin accounts for the remaining 19% of the variation. So what I've done here is an exact decomposition of firms' sales to other firms into 3 separate margins. The first margin is the number of buyers, the second margin is the share of buyers' costs, and the third margin is buyer size. Okay. And when I do this, the motive here is we want to understand why some firms are larger than others through their participation in these production networks. And there are 2 competing stories. It could be either because this firm itself is an attractive supplier, or because it happens to sell to larger buyers. And so what I find is that through this decomposition is the first 2 margins capture the attractiveness of the supplier, in the sense that how many buyers can it attract and how many suppliers, how much of their market share it can capture. And these 2 margins, the attractiveness of the supplier captures around 81% of the variation, as you can see. And then the customer size, the buyer size margin accounts for the remaining 19% of the variation. Now, the sales of firms to other firms, should vary by the location. So here I take into account that firms might have different costs of supplying to different locations. And so here I look at a more granular level of firms' sales to a particular destination. And here again, I conduct the same decomposition to find out whether it is the attractiveness of the suppliers or just the buyer size that drives dispersion in firm size. And here again, as you can see, almost 80% of the variation is going to come from firms being more attractive as a supplier rather than, and the remaining 20% is going to come from firms having larger buyers themselves. Okay. And not only across, across different destinations, even if we look at within firm across destination markets, the attractiveness margin, which is the first two margins, accounts for now 93% of the variation, and the customer size, the buyer size margin accounts for 7% of the variation. Now, how does this influence my choice of the model? So the variation in the number of buyers or the share of buyer's cost that a supplier accounts for arises from individual buyers sourcing decisions. So individual buyers are going to choose who to source inputs from and how much to source from them. So this individual buyers input sourcing decisions leads to network formation according to the model. And so I'm going to take this as motivation that a large part of the variation in firm sizes are arising from this endogenous network formation between firms. Yeah. And so putting the first two margins together, I regard this as the endogenous network margin. And with that in mind, I develop a model of endogenous network formation between firms. The way the model is going to reconcile with the facts that I just showed is that, in the model, low production cost firms will end up larger. And why is that? Because they're going to find more buyers. Just by being attractive, they can, being a productive supplier, they're going to find more buyers. And not only are they going to find more buyers, they're going to be used intensively by their buyers. And because these buyers use cheaper inputs intensively, they lower their production costs themselves and become more attractive suppliers, and they become larger themselves. So the first order effect is that, because of attractiveness of firms, a low production cost, because of whatever reason, they attract more buyers. Their buyers become low production cost suppliers to even more downstream buyers, and they become larger themselves. So through this model mechanism in the cross section, we would see that larger firms tend to have more buyers. They tend to be used more intensively by their buyers, and they also tend to have larger buyers. So with that in mind, I'm going to develop a general equilibrium model of firms located at different locations. So here I have two locations, A and B. There's going to be trade and intermediate inputs between firms across locations and within locations. Labor is going to be sourced locally by these firms, and consumers can source final goods from any location. So there's going to be trade across locations, and trade across locations is subject to iceberg costs, and so it's going to be costly to trade from a different location. Okay. And so here in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the production side of the model because that is where the meat of the model happens. Okay. So the production function in the model is quite simple. It is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of labor and materials, and within this firm has an idiosyncratic productivity Z, and within the materials block, the production function consists of multiple input requirements. And this is, again, Cobb-Douglas in symmetric across a discrete number of tasks K, and the material share is fixed depending on the location of the buyer. Now, to accomplish each of these symmetric tasks, the firm is going to choose output of potential suppliers, and to select the output of these potential suppliers are going to be perfect substitutes. So the firm is going to choose the lowest price supplier for each of its tasks. So it can choose the same supplier for multiple tasks, or none of the tasks, or some tasks, and so on. And so both the intensive and extensive margins of firm-to-firm trade are going to be endogenously determined in this model here. Now, this production function leads to the standard cost function, which is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate between wages at the destination where the buyer is located, and a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of the effective price of each task. Okay. And the effective price of each task is determined as the price charged by the lowest price supplier that is available to the buyer here. So the lowest price supplier is going to be determined by one who charges a lower markup. So here I assume an environment of Bertrand competition, and a supplier who itself has a lower marginal cost, and also a supplier who is nearby, so pays a lower trade cost of selling to the destination. And on top of all these three factors, there's a match productivity that varies between supplier and buyer. So this is trying to capture the variation that you're not simply going to select the lowest cost supplier, but you also account for compatibility in terms of technology. So any kind of match specific compatibility is going to be captured by these match specific productivity terms. Okay. So with this marginal cost function, I go to the data, and the first step in estimating this model is to recognize that this marginal cost function has a recursive kind of formulation. So the marginal cost of the buyer takes the place of the current period value function. The marginal cost of the supplier takes the place of the next period value function, and the material share of cost takes the place of the discount factor. So this kind of opens up a bunch of tools that we can use from the dynamic programming literature to solve this kind of model. And so in this quasi-dynamic programming problem, the estimates are, the exogenous estimates. We want to estimate the trade costs of trading across different locations, but also these endogenous estimates, which is the marginal cost of these buyers across different of individual buyers. And there are millions of these firms, and their marginal cost depends on the marginal cost of the supplier. And so it's going to be difficult to estimate this model using full solution methods that we see in dynamic programming, or even simulation-based methods can be burdensome if we have millions of parameters to estimate. So to get out of this problem, I take the conditional choice probability approach from dynamic discrete choice IO, which is to say that although we do not know what the marginal costs are, we can compute in closed form what the probability is of a firm getting selected for a task of a buyer downstream. And these conditional choice probabilities have a closed form where pi OD here is the probability that a seller S gets chosen as a supplier for buyer B, and that probability depends on the marginal cost of the supplier and the trade cost across different locations and the market access of that particular buyer. And so you can see here that if the supplier has a higher marginal cost or is located far away, it is less likely to be chosen as a supplier by the buyer. Okay. And the way these conditional choice probabilities map to the data is you take these conditional choice probabilities and map them to sample analogs. And the sample analogs in this case are going to be the cost shares between firms. So here I have the estimating equation, which is a multinomial logit estimating equation. So here on the right-hand side, I have the conditional choice probabilities. And on the left-hand side, this says in expectation, the cost share of the supplier S in the buyer's materials cost. Okay. And this multinomial logit model has, again, the several marginal cost estimates that were millions in number and were making life difficult for estimation. And so here, using these steps, I'm going to estimate this model using, semi-parametrically using Teller fixed effects, so we can get these marginal costs from the model itself. And then these trade costs are going to be projected on the usual regressors such as distance, borders, etc. Okay. And the multinomial logit model is a natural choice for estimating such a model, because the probability of sourcing across different suppliers adds to unity. So every buyer can only buy stuff from a selected list of suppliers. Yeah. So having
There is 5 minutes left, Piyush.
Okay. Thank you. So moving to counterfactual analysis, I'll be quick about this. So in aggregate trade models, we do exact hat algebra to find out the response of shocks. And aggregate trade models are somewhat degenerate in the sense that they lead to a unique model prediction which maps to observed data. Now, in a model with large networks and granularity, there's a lot of noise that happens at the granular level, and so the model is non-degenerate in the sense that it leads to a distribution of model predictions, and observed data is only one realization of what the model could predict. And so to conduct counterfactual analysis, I make an additional step where I take the observed data and I estimate the model, and using the estimated model, I compute the expected value of model predictions conditional on the initial state. And then the counterfactual evaluation then entails that I compute the change in these expected value of model predictions when I go from the initial to the counterfactual state. Okay. So with that in mind, let's get to the policy application, which is India's 2017 Goods and Services Tax Reform. So just to give you a reminder, prior to 2017 in India, each state had its own VAT tax system. So when firms sourced inputs from outside their own state, they paid a sales tax and they could not claim any input tax credit. So this itself made sourcing inputs from outside your own state costly. And so that was kind of the tangible cost, but there are also several intangible costs in terms of entry taxes and border inspection that made it even more expensive to source goods from outside your own state. And so this led to large border frictions across for trade across states, and there was some sort of a regional segregation of production in India. Okay. Now, in 2017, what the GST reform or the Goods and Services Tax Reform did is it harmonized the VAT system across different states. So these 30 odd VAT tax systems across India were abolished and they were replaced by a single unified tax system for the entire country. And with this, input tax credits could be obtained irrespective of where you source inputs from, where you source outside your own state or within your own state. And the motive for this kind of a reform was to alleviate these border frictions across states and create a unified market within the country. Okay. So the counterfactual exercise that I'm going to do is I estimate these border frictions for district pairs that cross state borders. So this is kind of the interstate border effect. And this is already controlling for border effects such as the inter-district border effect. So it's like a nested border effect, and I'm taking the border crossings of district pairs which cross state borders. And for these district pairs that are in different states, border frictions account for around 90% of estimated trade frictions. And so in the counterfactual analysis, I reduce these trade frictions by these 90%. And what do I see in the counterfactual equilibrium? I see that the production network reorganizes across space quite significantly. The dispersion in network connectivity across firms increases, which means more connected firms become even more connected and less connected firms become even less connected. Yeah. But at the same time, the dispersion in intermediate input sales across firms declines. So the larger firms, for the more connected and the larger firms, their sales is going to decline, whereas for the smaller firms or the less connected firms, their sales is going to increase. And over half of this variation is explained by endogenous changes in network structure. So to put that in mind, so this is a graph of the sales of different firms relative to the median firm. In red is the counterfactual state, and blue is the initial state. So if you look at the top quantile firm, the top quantile firms is around more than 3,000 times larger than the median firm, whereas in the counterfactual state, which is in red, it's somewhat less than 3,000. And you can see a monotonous, this pattern is quite similar for firms at different quantiles. Okay. So looking at the whole distribution, this is the change in sales of firms relative to the median firm. So here you can see the sales of firms above the median are going to decline. And so you see a reduction in the dispersion. They move closer to the median firm, and then firms which are below the median, for them, the sales is going to increase, and so they move above, closer to the median firm again. So there's a shrinkage of this firm size distribution. Okay. Now, how does this happen? So to understand the mechanisms of how the shrinkage in the firm size distribution happens, I separate the change in sales across different sales quantile into the change in intensity of use, which is kind of the first margin or the endogenous network margin that I was talking about, and the change in average buyer size across firms. Okay. I'm roughly out of time, but I'll wrap up in 2 minutes. Okay. And so to understand this, let's think about the top 5% firms. For the top 5% firms, their intensity of use is going to increase, which means they're going to find more buyers and capture larger market share among their buyers. But at the same time, these are firms that are more likely to be connected to firms at the top percentile of the sales distribution. And so even though they find more customers, they're also more likely to find customers who themselves have lost downstream sales. And so for these firms, the average buyer size is going to decline. So the net effect is that even though for the top 5% firms, even though they become more connected, their buyers themselves lose in terms of size, and so the net effect is that the sales declines. Now, if we go go to the next 5% firms, which is kind of like 90 to 95 percentile firms, and so here what happens is they of course have an increase in intensity of use, so they become more connected, but they also are more likely to be connected to firms in the top quintile, and so their average buyer size decreases. But overall, the net effects of these firms is that the increase in intensity of use is going to dominate the decrease in buyer size, and so eventually their sales are going to increase. And then looking at the next 60 to 90 percentile of firms, for them again, they become more connected, and their buyer size also increases because they are less likely to be connected to these firms which are lost in terms of sales. And so the net effect of these two, these two margins reinforce themselves, and so the sales of these group of firms increases. Now, the fourth group is the ones for which they lose in terms of connectivity. So they lose their buyers or decrease the market share among existing buyers. And for these firms, they're even less likely to be connected to firms at the top quintile. So their buyer size also increases. So the net effect is that for these large majority of firms for whom the connectivity has decreased, their buyer size instead increases, and that kind of effect dominates on the sales part. And so you see that the sales of this large majority of firms is going to increase. Okay. Now, to understand the contribution and put a number, the contribution of these margins and put a number on the contribution, I'm going to conduct a decomposition of the percentage change in sales into the percentage change in the intensity of use, percentage change in average buyer size, and a second order term. And the percentage change in intensity of use is going to put a number on the contribution of the endogenous network margin. And so here, what I find is that across all states, more than 50% of the changes in firm sales to other firms is going to come from endogenous changes in network structure. And on average, this is 72% across states. Now, on the right-hand side, within states across districts within the same state, you also see that it's almost always more than 50%. And so the endogenous network margin is what is driving this change in firm sales to other firms. Okay. So with that, I'd like to conclude by saying that I develop a tractable model of endogenous spatial production networks to explain new stylized facts about firm heterogeneity. And I propose a scalable framework for explanation and counterfactual analysis that does not run into problems, even if you have millions of firms in the model. And I study market integration following India's GST reform, which leads to reduced dispersion across firms and mostly due to endogenous network changes. Now, irrespective of the application here, I think it's a fertile baseline model for studying the impact of both micro shocks. So this is shocks at the firm level, and also macro shocks. This is shocks at the regional level on the spatial network economy, where we account for these endogenous network changes. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And if you have any questions or comments, this is my email, and now I'm open to questions as well.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor for questions now.
This is a very nice presentation. I have one question about the setting, because the model you write down is basically the only friction in the setting is the trade costs, but then you're applying it to India, and so I think anyone who knows that setting will know that the way that companies do business with each other is through relational contracts. But this is completely outside the scope of your model, and so I'm trying to reconcile how the realities of how companies do business in India with this kind of frictionless model of matching that you've kind of built, and how we should think about interpreting the lens of the results of the model through kind of those frictions that we might think are encountered in a country like India.
Sure. Thanks. That's a great question. And so here in the model, if you remember, there was a part where I showed match-specific productivity, which is supposed to soak up all these, in the simple model, is supposed to soak up all these frictions that are, that impede trade between two firms that are not trade costs. So in a richer model, when we have like more data on how relational contracts would work, that would be the part of the model that I would enrich in terms of giving it more meat in terms of making it more heterogeneous, I guess.
Okay, so then can I ask a second question? It's unrelated. So you refer to the 2017 GST as a counterfactual, but it's not counterfactual because it happened. And so can you benchmark, like this 90% drop in trade costs doesn't seem right given what we have now known about what happened around the time of the GST implementation. And so I'm wondering if the results that you get actually match what we see in the data, because that would make it much more powerful in terms of whether the model's a good model to be used down the future.
Right. So, so two reasons. The first is the data I have is only prior to the GST reform, so I cannot map it to firm level outcomes after the reform. And so in terms of aggregate outcomes, I do not present the aggregate outcomes because they're not like the focus of this paper. So I'm focusing more on the distributional outcomes. In terms of aggregate implications, I see like a 8 to 10%, a maximum of 8% welfare gain across different districts in India. And that is similar to what you would get in an aggregate trade model as well. So it's not, so it's not so conditional on the fact that I'm doing a 90% reduction in border frictions. The aggregate implications are not completely out of what we typically expect. But again, looking at the 90% change, of course, it's a huge change. But two things. So it's an upper bound on how things would happen. And second, so typically we would expect some sort of border effect for crossing any spatial kind of unit. And so here I have these nested set of dummies where I have inter-district border as well as interstate border. So this is really capturing something that is, not border effect, but something about crossing different states. So it could be true that this 90% reduction is not what actually happens with GST, but perhaps we can look at the firm size distribution using some aggregate data to see, to discipline the model in terms of how much it can predict. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I've got a small question in the comment. It's on the intensity of use. You use this average intensity. I'm just wondering, do you take into account indirect effects, so buyers of buyers, or buyers of buyers of buyers? So what does that imply for the value chain in terms of its length and intensity? That's my question.
Thanks. That's a great question. So the direct effect is the intensity of use, and the indirect effects, which is the second order effect and the higher order effect, are going to be captured through the buyer size. So the fact that you being a low marginal cost supplier makes your buyers more productive is going to be captured by the size of the buyers, and so that kind of captures all the second order and higher order terms, if that answers your question. So if you think about, let's say, the expansion of the Leontief inverse, the first term is going to be the intensity of use, and the remaining terms are going to be the average buyer size.
Okay, thanks. And the other comment is that I find your paper very interesting for, I think Brazil is trying to do something similar. They've been planning to try and reform their tax system as well. They have a similar problem to India. So your research and your prediction for India are very interesting, especially in the case of Brazil. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to be involved in that if possible.
The VAT reform in India 2017 has certainly improved the global competitiveness of SMEs in India. And that's based on intuition. And there's a big impact on Indian SMEs. Huh? Can you share with us? I mean, that's intuition, as I said. Have you done any study on how the VAT reform 2017 has lifted the productivity of Indian SMEs, and because of that has improved the global competitiveness of Indian SMEs?
Yeah, so I mean, my model is quite simplistic to talk about these rich implications, but so any sort of exercise that reduces frictions of trading between firms within a country is going to improve productivity overall. So what I find in this model is that, so I cannot separate increase in productivity versus finding better suppliers. So these are two things that can help SMEs become more attractive to their own downstream customers. So here what I find is that when we have a market integration exercise, in the sense that even small firms find it easier to sell to further locations, then for the firms which are smaller, they grow relative to the firms which are larger, because even though these firms are not like an important part of the production network, they still exist in the sense that they keep supplying to their own customers and they increase in size after this kind of a reform. I hope that answers your question. If not, please let me know.
So if there are no further questions, we'll just thank you very much, Piyush. We'll end this session. And maybe later on, if there's any other comment, we can reach out to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Piyush. Thank you, Nuria. So now we will have our lunch break. So please kindly adjourn to the atrium downstairs for lunch. And we will reconvene at 2 p.m. sharp for our third sessions on trade and environment. A quick reminder, when you have the time, please do help us complete the poll by scanning the QR code on the desk. Thank you.